Chapter 163. There was a strange platform in the middle of the lake that was empty just a moment ago. The platform was stacked on top of each other, as if it was formed by pieces of green leaves. It was the size of a square table, and it shone under the moonlight. However, this was not what shocked Ning Xuemo the most. What stunned her the most was that there was a child sitting on the platform. It was a child that looked like it was carved out of fine jade. The child looked to be about 2 years old. He had slightly closed eyes, a tall nose, light pink lips, and a cinnabar mole that looked like a flower bud between his eyebrows. He was only wearing a light silver dudu, revealing his fair arms and legs. He was meditating with his eyes closed. His snow-white hair was draped over his body like a curtain, and it shone with a silver luster under the moonlight. The platform was in the middle of the lake, and the moonlight shone on him. The surroundings were hazy like a veil. In the half-lit landscape, only his figure was so distinct. The moonlight generously created a circle of faint silver light around him, as if he was enveloped in a layer of Buddha's light, immortal. Monster. Or a mountain elf. Ning Xuemo stared at the child, and a few guesses flashed through her mind. Naturally, she did not think that he was human. After all, this was the 9th peak that normal people could not enter. No child would come here by accident. She held her breath, and her eyes fell on the cinnabar mole between his eyebrows. The shape of the cinnabar mole looked a little like a ginseng flower. Could this be a ginseng baby? Ning Xuemo's eyes lit up. She looked at his fair arms and legs, and the image of a fat ginseng flashed past her eyes. Ginseng was a great tonic. It was said that ginseng would take a human form after 100 years, a head and a face after 500 years, and all 5 senses after 1,000 years. It could only transform into a human form after 10,000 years. Usually, it would be in the shape of a baby. There were countless legends about ginseng babies among the people, but the most famous one was that one could live forever after eating one. In the legends, Zhang Guolao became an immortal after eating a ginseng spirit. This place was deserted, and the lake was so strange that no one would be able to come here in 10,000 years. It was not impossible for a ginseng to cultivate into a human form. She didn't expect to bump into one when she came here by accident. How lucky! Since she had encountered him, she would not let him go. Maybe if she ate this ginseng baby, her power would increase greatly and she would become a genius beauty. She would be able to do whatever she wanted on this continent. More importantly, after her cultivation had greatly increased, she was more confident that she could break out of this mountain peak. She secretly took a deep breath and looked at the things she had brought with her. She needed silver needles and red threads to catch the ginseng essence. There were silver needles and silk threads, but unfortunately, they were not red. However, this was not a problem for her. She gently cut her finger with a short knife and dyed the thread red with blood. Then, he put it into a small sealed bottle. When everything was ready, she slipped into the water again. She was an excellent swimmer. She could swim underwater for 3 minutes without needing to breathe. She swam underwater like a silent barracuda and moved towards the platform. Nearer, nearer still. The distance was about 500 meters. Ning Xuemo only took 2 breaths along the way. In between breaths, she glanced at the boy again. The boy was still meditating, oblivious to the approaching danger. When she was close to the green platform, Ning Xuemo slowed down. She first gathered her strength in the water and held the silver needles in her hand. Chapter 164. Legend had it that one had to prick the ginseng baby to seal it so that it could not run away. Head. Neck. Chest. Legs. Feet. She had read too few myths, so she could not remember. She approached from the back of the boy and looked at him from the surface of the water. She saw that the skin of the boy's back was like a beautiful jade carving under the moonlight, without a single flaw. His silvery hair flowed into the water, as smooth as the moonlight. Such a posture of the boy's back was extremely beautiful. If she were to prick him with the needle, Ning Xuema suddenly felt that she could not do it. Forget it. According to the legend, it was wrapped with a red thread. She might as well prick the boy's undergarment with the silver needle and wrap the thread around his neck. In this case, she could only go around to the front of the boy. She silently dived into the water again and inevitably saw the roots of the green leaf platform. Her heart skipped a beat. The bottom of the green leaf platform was like a big tree. There was a huge root system with countless aerial roots crisscrossing in the water. These fine aerial roots were hollow, allowing fine streams of water to flow into them. Ning Xuema could clearly see the gurgling sound of the water flowing inside the aerial roots. The direction of the flow was precisely the direction where the boy was sitting cross-legged. Could it be that the boy was not only absorbing the essence of the moon, but also absorbing the spiritual energy in the lake? This was a good idea. The spiritual energy here was the richest. If one cultivated well, cultivating here for a year would be equivalent to cultivating elsewhere for 100 years. No wonder the ginseng baby was so fresh and beautiful. Hee. Even if you cultivate into a demon, you will still be my food today. She was like a snake hunting its prey, quietly swimming to the front of the boy and slowly approaching him. Then, she suddenly launched an attack. The silver needle in her hand was like a ray of light, with a red thread running directly towards the boy's undergarment, fast, accurate, and ruthless. Only these 3 words could be compared to Ning Xuema's attack. The boy was obviously not prepared. Before he even opened his eyes, the silver needle had already pierced into his undergarment. What Ning Xuema did not expect was that the moment the silver needle touched the boy's undergarment, it was as if it had touched a mill. It instantly shattered and disappeared without a trace. At the crucial moment, the red thread was still powerful. It did not stop and continued to wrap around the boy's body. There was a way. Ning Xuema's movements were extremely fast. When the red thread wrapped around the boy's body, she suddenly jumped out of the water and pounced on the boy like a hungry tiger hunting for its prey. With a plopped sound, Ning Xuema landed on the green leaf platform, but there was nothing in her arms. She hurriedly opened her eyes and found that the boy who was originally sitting on the green platform had disappeared. When she pounced down, her arms were clearly about to hug the boy's body. Unexpectedly, when he closed his arms, he only hugged a ball of air. It disappeared just like that. Her red string was clearly wrapped around him. Ning Xuema hurriedly looked at the red thread. One end of the red thread was tied to her little finger, and the other end was wrapped around the ginseng baby. At this moment, the red thread on her finger was still fine, but the other end was submerged in the water. The ginseng baby fell into the water. As expected of someone who had cultivated into a demon. How vigilant! Ning Xuema jumped up and was about to jump into the water. She was not on guard against the platform that was formed by the green leaves. The green leaves suddenly expanded and flew over. Very obviously, the platform wanted to wrap her up like dumpling filling. Needless to say, this was the work of the ginseng baby. Ning Xuema tapped her toes on the platform and leaped up. When the green leaves were about to wrap around her, she flew out. Chapter 165. Her movements could not be described as slow, but the green leaves grew even faster, comparable to lightning. Just as her body was about to break free from the encirclement of the green leaves suddenly grew another 2 feet in the air, and suddenly closed in. Ning Xuema's head was covered in dense green, her head slammed into the leaves. The leaves were obviously soft, but when she bumped into them, she felt a burning pain. Her body fell from above and landed on the green platform below. At this moment, the green leaves around her had completely closed. She felt like she was trapped in a ball of green leaves, like a flower bud wrapped in layers of leaves. She naturally was not willing to be trapped like this. she struggled left and right inside, but these green leaves looked tender, as if they would break with a poke, but in fact they were more flexible than cowhide. No matter if she punched them or cut them with a knife, it was useless. She simply could not open the slightest gap, unable to break free. Not only that, after the green leaves wrapped around her, they began to shrink, squeezing her from all directions. Ning Xuema was wrapped inside, the space was getting smaller and smaller, and gradually she almost could not breathe. She desperately tried to find a way to break out of the encirclement, and did not see the boy standing not far away on the water. The water gently rippled, his silver hair like satin fluttering in the wind. His pair of deep blue eyes, like the waves of the sea, fell on the green flower bud that wrapped around Ning Xuema. A trace of astonishment flashed across his eyes. Someone could break in here. How is that possible? The red thread that Ning Xuema threw out was originally wrapped around his waist, but now it was hooked around his little finger as white as jade. His long eyelashes drooped down, as if he was sensing something. A moment later, he opened his eyes, the astonishment in his eyes deepened. The little girl who broke in here is actually a psychokinesis trash. A trash can break in here, simply defying the natural order. Even rarer than the 8 wonders of the world. If he met such a rare person, he could let her go. Perhaps he could keep her by his side to study, or teach her some martial arts, so that her miracle could reach a higher level. But this place does not allow any outsiders to enter, and does not allow outsiders to know. No one can be an exception. So, the boy pursed his thin lips and a faint light flashed across his eyes. His fingers slowly tightened. Following his movements, the green flower bud began to close even faster. Ning Xuema, who was inside, naturally sensed that the green leaves around her were closing faster and faster. At this rate, she would be squeezed into a pile of fertilizer by these green walls in less than a minute. It seemed that the ginseng baby wasn't easy to deal with. She couldn't bear to stab him, but he could bear to squeeze her. Ning Xuema could not help but tug at the red thread between her fingers. This thread was the legendary heavenly silkworm silk, and it was given to her by Ji Yunhuang. She had always kept it on her body like a treasure. Its flexibility was the best in the world, and it was a good treasure for her to escape in times of danger. This time, he had spent a lot of effort to tie up this ginseng baby. He knew that ordinary threads were probably useless against this ginseng baby. The red thread became taut as she hooked it. It was obvious that there was still something tied to the other end. The doll had not escaped yet. Is he still in the water? If she could pull him over and restrain him, perhaps she could escape from this damn green ball. Ning Xuema secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Her internal force poured into the thin red thread, and she suddenly pulled. Hiss. She let out a low cry. Chapter 166. The other end of the red thread felt like it was tied to a mountain. She did not manage to pull the other party over. Instead, she staggered and her little finger hurt. The thin red thread pierced into her palm, creating a bloody groove. Blood began to drip down like pearls. The boy outside was still hooking his finger on the red thread. Ning Xuema's pull only made him frown slightly. He sensed her strength and his eyes fell on the green ball again. He seemed to be able to see the person inside through the layers of green leaves. Inside, Ning Xuema suddenly had an illusion. She felt a pair of ice-cold eyes sizing her up. This feeling was so clear that it made her body stiffen instantly. Di-Zun. Di-Zun came. No, Di-Zun was still pretending to be an ice sculpture in the palace of Chongkong country. It was said that he had to stay for 3 days. It had only been 2 days. He should still be meditating there. How could he come here? Illusion, it must be an illusion. At this moment, her blood finally dripped on the green leaf under her feet. This green leaf was strange. When the blood fell on it, it did not seep out. Instead, it rolled like a pearl. The green leaf suddenly trembled as if it was disgusted by the blood. It shook with all its might, trying to shake the blood out. It did not close up quickly. This green leaf was afraid of her blood. Ning Xuemo finally saw a glimmer of hope to survive. She cut her hand with a short knife. In order to make the cut more effective, she made a deep cut. Blood gushed out like a spring and flowed like a stream. Her body spun like a top and she wiped the surrounding walls with her blood-stained hand. The entangled green leaves avoided her. Soon, the green ball was forced to disperse by her blood-stained hand. She finally saw the starry sky again. Almost at the same time, Ning Xuemo flew up. Her judgment of the direction was very accurate. She directly pounced on the boy standing in the rippling water. "Little ginseng child, let's see where you can run to this time." The moment she escaped, the boy's fingers seemed to be about to form a spell. When he heard her words, he was slightly stunned. At the moment he was stunned, Ning Xuemo had already pounced on him. Her movements were as fast as lightning. The boy couldn't dodge in time and was pounced on by her. Splash! The two hugged each other and rolled into the water, creating a huge splash. The baby's skin was smooth and soft like milk chocolate. Ning Xuemo was very good at hugging people. Her right arm hugged his upper body, and even his two little arms were wrapped tightly around it. Her left arm held his two calves so that he couldn't move his limbs. The big one and the small one are rolling in the water, and they can't stop for a while. Ning Xuemo tries to balance herself with her legs. She hugged him like this. Her face was very close to his little face, and their eyes met. The little baby's watery blue eyes were like an intoxicating sea. They were as calm as a frozen lake, but they were also rippling with waves. Ning Xuemo's heart skipped a beat. Since she was sure that the other party was a ginseng baby, she wanted to take a bite out of it the moment she hugged it. But looking at such a pair of eyes, she couldn't bite it. Her lips rubbed against his face. His face was so tender that it seemed like water could come out with a pinch. When her lips touched it, it was like touching a piece of warm jade. The baby was probably not used to being so close to people, so he struggled in her arms and tilted his head back slightly, trying to avoid her lips. Chapter 167. This little thing still wanted to escape. He still wanted to avoid her. Not a chance. Although Ning Xuemo couldn't bring herself to bite him, she didn't mind kissing him. She didn't hold back either. She tightened her arms, lowered her head, and pecked him on his pink lips, so tender. So tender. His little lips were like soft tofu or jelly, as if they would melt in her mouth. There was also an indescribable fragrance. Ning Xuemo had interacted with many people in her previous life, but she had never really interacted with babies. She wanted to give him a kiss to show off her sovereignty, but when she held his soft lips in her mouth, she couldn't help but want to take a bite. However, if she took a bite, she would bite off such beautiful lips. Such a beautiful baby wouldn't look good without a mouth. She suddenly felt guilty for destroying a work of art. However, she was really hungry. She caught this ginseng baby to satisfy her appetite. Should she bite him or not? Ning Xuemo hesitated for a moment with the baby's mouth in her mouth. The baby in her arms probably felt that she had bad intentions. A cold light flashed in his eyes, and his little hands that were trapped in her arms started to form a spell. However, how smart was Ning Xuemo? Since she thought that he was a ginseng baby, she would naturally be on guard against him using any immortal spells. She was especially careful with his little hands. Therefore, when his fingers moved, before he could form any spell, his fingers suddenly tightened. Ning Xuemo's arms wrapped around his body and grabbed his little hands. Ning Xuemo's hands weren't big. They could even be said to be small and delicate. However, compared to this baby's little hands, it was very intimidating. Her hands completely covered his little hands. The baby couldn't form any spells anymore. The baby's eyes flashed. Ning Xuemo was still hesitating whether she should bite off his little mouth. Suddenly, she felt a cold sensation between her lips and teeth. His little tongue directly entered her mouth. Ning Xuemo was shocked. She instinctively moved her head back and finally let go of his little mouth. She stared at the baby in her arms. He knew how to French kiss at such a young age. He didn't learn well. No, this little kid definitely didn't want to kiss her with his tongue. Instead, he wanted to use his tongue to cast some kind of spell in her mouth. Earlier, when his little tongue touched her tongue, it caused her tongue to go numb for a moment. If she hadn't reacted quickly, her entire mouth would have gone numb, and she might have even choked on a few mouthfuls of water. This little ginseng spirit seemed to be very unwilling to be captured. He tried every possible way to break free from her, but unfortunately, she didn't fall for his tricks. Ning Xuemo held his hand even tighter. She couldn't avoid touching the red thread on his finger. If it was an ordinary silk thread, it would melt and return to its original color after soaking it in water for a moment. However, this sky silk thread was different. If it was not washed with a special method after being soaked in blood, the blood would always adhere to it, and it would be bright as if it had just been dripped on. His small hand was as white as a lotus root, and the red thread on it was exceptionally conspicuous. Ning Xuemo's heart skipped a beat. She remembered that her red thread was wrapped around his waist, but for some reason, it was now wrapped around his fingers. Could it be that the red string that tied the ginseng baby would automatically move? Had it moved to the part where she could control him the most? For example, this little finger. The red string on Ning Xuemo's hand was also tied to her finger. Coincidentally, it was the same hand that was holding the child's hand. As luck would have it, the two fingers tied to the red string overlapped each other. Chapter 168. Ning Xuemo lowered her head and saw it. She was embarrassed. This was like the two fated people tied by Yu Lao's red string. Pfft, what was she thinking? He was just an ingredient that she caught, and she would eat him later. How could he be the fated person? Even if he was a person, he was so small and not even as tall as a garlic sprout. It was impossible for him to be the fated person. She was thinking too much. To be safe, she grabbed the red string floating around and wrapped it around the little guy in her arms. Although this ginseng baby had high magic power, he was still a baby and didn't have much strength. Therefore, after Ning Xuemo got close to him and restrained him, he simply stopped struggling. He just looked at her with a pair of blue eyes, slightly pursed his lips, and his expression was calm. His long hair was floating in the water just now, and a few strands were wrapped around Ning Xuemo's wrist and shoulder, making her itch. When Ning Xuemo wrapped the red string around him, she also wrapped his long hair. This little baby had high magic power, and he was a ginseng. His hair might be the whiskers of ginseng, and it might be able to wrap around people. It wasn't easy for her to restrain him. She didn't want to fail miserably and be entangled by his long hair. Besides, if it was a 10,000-year-old ginseng, the whiskers of ginseng were also very nourishing. She couldn't lose a single one and waste it. Ning Xuemo held him and rolled under the water for a while, then stopped the downward momentum. She paused and wanted to paddle up. She couldn't cook him in the water. If she wanted to eat him, she had to get him ashore and eat him slowly. Why did this baby suddenly become so heavy? She held him as if she was holding a big rock. She couldn't swim up and continued to sink instead. She looked down at the baby in her arms. The baby looked at her expressionlessly, and his red lips were slightly pouted. Was he provoking her? Ning Xuemo originally wanted to put the short knife on his neck to threaten him, but now both of her hands were occupied and she couldn't free them. She had an idea and lowered her head, and her red lips were close to the baby's delicate ear. "Little kid, if you play any tricks, I'll bite your ear directly." It was originally inconvenient to speak in the water, but she could still speak with her mouth close to his ear. It was just that her voice was a little strange. After she finished speaking, she even put his earlobe in her mouth and bit it threateningly with her little teeth. The baby's body stiffened for a moment, but its weight suddenly lightened. It was the weight of a normal baby. "That's more like it." Ning Xuema was pleased with herself. She finally let go of his ear and swam upwards. The two of them finally emerged from the water. Ning Xuema let out a sigh of relief. Although she had only been underwater for a short period of time, she had done a lot of things. Now, she was really tired. The silvery moonlight shone on the child in his arms, making her appear tender and tender. Looking at her up close, the child's facial features were astonishingly beautiful. She was exquisite and perfect, like a crystal doll. Ning Xuema couldn't take her eyes off him. "What do you want?" The child finally spoke. His voice was crisp like a string of crystal wind chimes in the wind, and there was a touch of coldness in his voice. "Why don't you guess?" Ning Xuema smiled at him, revealing 4 sparkling white teeth as she replied with an enigmatic tone. The baby's pair of ocean blue eyes blinked. "I can't guess." "Okay, then you don't have to guess. You'll know in a while. Be good and I'll make you feel better." Ning Xuema smiled as if she was comforting him, and she swam towards the shore. Chapter 169. The child's eyelashes were wet. He pursed his lips and did not speak anymore. Ning Xuema stepped on the water. In fact, she was also paying attention to his movements at all times, afraid that he would do something new. The child probably stopped cursing. His little face was gently pressed against her chest, and he was very obedient. The surface of the lake rippled, and the green leaf platform had disappeared without a trace. Under the moonlight, the surface of the lake was like a mirror. If it were not for the child in her arms, Ning Xuema would have thought that everything was a dream. She quickly swam to the shore and carried the child up. She was so tired that her forehead was covered in sweat. She sat on a big rock by the shore and still hugged the child tightly in her arms, not daring to put him on the ground. Ginseng children should know the earth escape technique. If she put him on the ground, he might disappear with a swoosh. How was she going to eat him? Ning Xuema looked at the child and suddenly understood how Tang Sanzang felt when he ate the ginseng fruit back then. The ginseng fruit that Tang Sanzang obtained looked like a child, but it was not alive. At least it was still a fruit. When he ate it, he could just bite it. But the person in her arms had soft skin, big sparkling eyes, and a small red mouth that could talk and move. She was clearly a little child of the human world. She was so beautiful that even the heavens would be jealous of her. She couldn't bring herself to kiss her. No matter where she bit him, she felt that she was committing a sin. She was not a soft-hearted person. She had killed many people in her life, but she had never killed a child, let alone eat one. It seemed that Zhang Guolao was much more ruthless than her. Sob, sob, sob. Perhaps she should close her eyes and throw him into the pot to stew, but there was no pot or firewood here. Strangely enough, although the lake was surrounded by trees, there was not a single leaf or branch to be found. Unless she walked further away, she raised her head and looked into the distance. In the distance, there were strange-shaped rocks and lush trees. Under the moonlight, they looked mysterious and dangerous. This was the 9th peak. Any animal that came out of it would be enough to keep her busy for half a day. It was better not to provoke them for the time being. Gurgle gurgle, a soft sound entered their ears. It was Ning Xuema's intestines. So hungry. Ning Xuema swallowed her saliva. Are you hungry? The child asked again. Not bad, Ning Xuema said with a straight face. Her eyes fell on his silvery hair that was as smooth as the moonlight. Suddenly, she had an idea. She raised her hand and pulled out 2 strands of his hair. Then, she looked at them hopefully. Why did she pull his hair? Goo! Incantation. The child raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at her. After a while, Ning Xuema's face fell. TV dramas really killed people. She clearly remembered that in a movie, she had seen someone pluck out an old ginseng man's beard, and it turned into ginseng whiskers. However, the hair in her hand was still hair, and it didn't seem to have changed at all. Could that be the ginseng elder and this was a child? Whiskers can change, but baby hair can't. Why can't your hair turn into a ginseng beard? Ning Xuema took out a short knife and placed it horizontally on the child's neck. Hurry up and change a few strands. Otherwise, I'll eat you. The child's lips twitched. He looked down at the short knife on his neck and then looked at her. You want to eat ginseng? That's right. Hurry up and change them. Ning Xuema pressed the short knife down slightly. Her short knife was also given to her by Ji Yunhuang. It was a sharp blade and was a good knife. It shone with a cold light under the moonlight. Chapter 170. This child's skin was as tender as a lotus root. She really wanted to take a bite but did not want to hurt him. Although the knife was pressed against his neck, it was very measured. The child sighed softly. Then let me go, I'll give you the ginseng. She was holding him too tightly, he could not even take his hand away. If I let you go, you'll run away again. Ning Xuema did not let go. You can just come out. The child, he gritted his teeth, don't worry, I won't run away. If you let go of one of my hands, I can give you 100-year-old ginseng. Ning Xuema was somewhat suspicious. This child was too cunning. Just now he made her suffer a big loss. She had to guard against him. After thinking for a moment, she really let go of one of his hands, the one with the red string. Then hurry up, if you dare to play any tricks, I'll directly cut off your little head. Ning Xuema directly put the knife to his throat, full of threat. The child really did not have any intention of playing any tricks. His little hand gently patted his dudu. A thick-looking ginseng emerged. Ning Xuema's eyes lit up. She raised her hand and took the ginseng. The ginseng should really be 100 years old. It had already taken shape. It looked white and plump. There were dozens of whiskers below. Ning Xuema smiled. With this ginseng, she can eat to her heart's content and no longer have to go hungry. It seems that the child in her arms is really a ginseng child. Otherwise, how can a ginseng appear just by patting his dudu? She really picked up a treasure. Is his dudu 100 treasures pouch? He can produce ginseng with just a pat. Then what about her? Ning Xuema was a person of action. She immediately took action when she thought of something, so she also patted his dudu. In the end, she did not manage to pat a shrimp. She did not give up. She simply patted all sides, but did not guard against the fact that she patted a little lower, right between his legs. The child was originally looking at her with a faint smile, but at this moment, his expression changed slightly. He raised his fingertips and a spell was instantly formed. A white light flashed in front of Ning Xuema's eyes. It was so dazzling that she closed her eyes subconsciously. Suddenly, there was nothing between her arms. She hurriedly opened her eyes. The baby in her arms had disappeared. Fuck, he still managed to escape. Ning Xuema jumped up and hurriedly looked around. Ginseng baby usually used earth escape to escape, but he could only run underground. But the ground around her was covered with grass, and she could not see a decent hole. She looked at the red string tied to her finger. The red string was fluttering in the wind, and the baby on the other end of the red string had long run away. She searched the surrounding grass again, trying to find a stalk of ginseng, but to no avail. She sighed and sat down on the stone again. So what if he ran away? Even if he was in her hands, she didn't know what to do with him. After all, he couldn't bring himself to bite her, and holding her would be a burden. Fortunately, the ginseng he gave her was still there, enough to appease her hunger. She was also afraid that the ginseng child was up to no good, so she first tested it with a silver needle to confirm that it was not poisonous, and then slowly ate it. She was really hungry. A radish-sized ginseng was finished in a moment, finally satisfying her hunger. The baby did not lie to her. The ginseng he gave her was at least 100 years old. Because she had just climbed out of the water, and this was the peak of a mountain, the weather was cold. Her body was cold, and she almost shivered as she sat there. Chapter 171. But after eating the ginseng, her stomach felt warm and there was a warm current flowing around her body. In a moment, the cold feeling disappeared and there were even beads of sweat on her forehead. She wiped the sweat off her forehead and her heart slightly moved. This ginseng seemed to be more than 100 years old. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so effective. She couldn't just eat it like a radish and forget about it after eating it. She had to circulate it and let it play its best role. She looked around and it was quiet all around. Only the sound of the mountain breeze could be heard and no other movement could be heard. She didn't expect this place to be a paradise. She had been ashore for so long, but she didn't see the legendary ferocious magical beast. After all, she was alone outside and she was naturally worried about being alone in such a dangerous place. She simply got up and began to move the big stones by the lake. Now that her inner energy had reached a certain level, it wasn't too difficult to move these big stones. She quickly placed the stones one by one to the east and another to the west and arranged them according to a certain pattern. In a short time, she arranged an array. This array was created according to the Chiman Duanjia. It was divided into 8 gates and was ever-changing. It could block 100,000 soldiers. She sat in the middle of the array and with this array as protection, even if the magical beasts came here, they wouldn't be able to get close to her. After everything was arranged, she let out a sigh of relief and sat on a big stone to meditate. She didn't see that on a big tree not far away, the little child's figure appeared again. At this moment, the dudu on his body was gone and in its place was a small robe. The white robe was like snow and there were faint dark patterns on it. The big round moon was behind him and the moonlight was like water flowing on his robe. His silver hair and white robe fluttered in the wind. This scene was as beautiful as a painting. Unfortunately, Ning Xuema didn't see it. She had completely entered a meditative state. The tree that the child was standing on was very tall and he could overlook the whole scene. His pair of deep blue eyes sized up the stone array around her and then looked at her who was sitting in the middle of the array. His eyes flashed with a hint of interest. She was setting up an array. This was the first time he saw an array that didn't need psychokinesis to scatter the stones. Did she think that a pile of stones in a disorderly manner would be able to resist the beasts here? Even the weakest magical beast would be able to smash these stones into pieces with just a few swipes of its claws. She was still a child after all. She was too naive. His gaze fell on her meditating posture. Ning Xuema was practicing internal strength at this time, so her posture of meditation was also the posture of practicing internal strength. Naturally, it was different from the posture of practicing psychokinesis here. His eyesight was amazing. Ning Xuema was drenched and her clothes stuck to her body. He could see the subtle changes in her skin and judge the flow of qi in her body. A strange cultivation method, a strange aura, and a strange girl. He had lived for so many years, but he had never seen such a strange girl. Ning Xuema's inner energy circulated faster and faster, and the heat generated caused her clothes to dry at a speed visible to the naked eye. White steam rose from the top of her head. From afar, it looked like there was a steamer on her head. The little child stared at the steamer above her head with great interest, even forgetting about his own cultivation. After looking for a while, his eyes flashed slightly. He gently plucked a wide leaf. After a few folds, he actually plucked out a tiger. He made a gesture with his fingertips and pointed at the green leaf tiger. He threw it into the array. Chapter 172. He made a hand seal with his fingertips and pointed at the green leaf tiger. He threw it into the array. A gust of wind blew past, and the green leaf tiger turned into a colorful tiger. Its roar shook the heavens and earth. Ning Xuema was startled by the tiger's roar. She opened her eyes and looked outside the array. Then, she suddenly jumped up. What a big tiger! It was twice as big as the Siberian tiger she had seen before. What surprised her the most was that this tiger had green fur. She had seen white tigers, snow tigers, and tigers with yellow and black stripes, but this was the first time she saw a tiger with emerald green fur. It was indeed a perverted animal in a perverted world. This was probably a unique species in the ninth peak. Ning Xuema stared at the tiger's figure that flashed through the array from time to time. She clenched the dagger in her hand tightly. Maybe this was not a tiger, but the legendary Cheongqi. Cheongqi in the game had a weird color. However, Cheongqi seemed to have wings, but this guy did not. Also, its eyes were green and bright. Under the moonlight, they looked like green will-o'-the-wisps. This tiger landed in the stone array. It seemed to have smelled Ning Xuema's scent immediately. It immediately roared and pounced in Ning Xuema's direction. Its body was huge, but its body was very agile. It jumped over a 2-foot-tall rock. It jumped onto a big rock, bent down, and pounced toward Ning Xuema, who was in the center of the array. Bang! With a loud sound, it collided with a large rock that appeared out of thin air. It was obviously not prepared. It fell to the ground with a thud. It shook its head and looked in front of it in surprise. When it pounced, it did not see the rock. How did it crash into it? It looked at its surroundings again. The scenery had changed. When it landed on the ground, it saw scattered boulders. The largest boulder was only 2 feet tall. It had only pounced for a while, but the surrounding rocks grew bigger. Each of them was 4 to 5 feet tall and stood around it. It was sandwiched in the middle, and there was no way out. Roar! Roar! The tiger was enraged. Its body frequently leaped up, but it frequently hit its head. There were many places where it looked like an open space, but when it jumped over, it would always hit a big rock that appeared out of nowhere. The collision made it see stars, and it was furious. Of course, because of its extraordinary strength, the large rocks that were hit by it did not fare any better and were directly smashed into pieces. Thus, the boy hidden in the leaves on the tree saw the following scene. The tiger that he had put down was bumping around in the seemingly fragile stone formation. In his opinion, it was obvious that it would be able to catch Ning Xuema with its mouth and complete the mission after leaping over 2 more stones. However, the stupid tiger had taken a detour and foolishly used its big head to hit the stones. It was so angry that it was stamping with rage. Idiot! The boy didn't want to see its stupid appearance anymore, so he decided not to look at it. Instead, he looked at the stone array again. Without the support of psychokinesis, it was just an ordinary stone placed there. Could it be that it had a hallucinogenic effect? The stone array looked ordinary, but there was a kind of aura in the array. This aura was invisible, but it was inexplicably frightening. His gaze swept across every big rock, and the expression in his eyes changed from indifference to concentration. It was the first time he had seen this kind of array, and he could not help but take a few more glances. There were too few things in this world that could attract his attention. However, this little girl had broken the rules several times, which aroused his interest. Chapter 173. Even he had never seen or heard of the kind of formations that she was cultivating in. Where did she learn all of this from? He crossed his arms and continued to watch. Although the little girl's array was strange and powerful, these stones were just ordinary stones. They were constantly smashed into pieces by the green tiger, and the number of stones in the array was decreasing. Once the number of stones decreased to a certain point, the array would be broken. Without the array, the little girl would have to confront the green tiger directly. What would she do then? What kind of surprise tactic would he use to achieve victory? Inside the array, Ning Xuemo was cursing in her heart. This green tiger is too abnormal. Its head was harder than a stone. If she let it continue to smash into the stones, it would be right in front of her in less than an hour. She had to get rid of it before the array was broken. She leaped up and her palms were like blooming lotuses. She slammed her palms on every stone around her. Her movements were agile and she moved around the array as if she was flying. Suddenly, she flashed past the green tiger. The green tiger subconsciously slammed its paw, but it only hit a stone. The stone was smashed into pieces under its paw, but the girl hid behind another stone and waved at it. "Green hair, come and catch me." The girl smiled like a flower, but the green tiger did not have any pity for her. It roared and pounced on her again. Bang! Its head crashed into another stone. The stone was smashed into pieces, but a few rays of cold light shot out from the cracks of the stone and pierced into its head. The green tiger staggered backward, but it did not fall. It only shook its head and continued to smash into the array. Ning Xuemo was speechless. The silver needles she had placed in the cracks of the stone were highly poisonous. Even a dinosaur would be knocked over in an instant. She did not expect that the green tiger would be fine. This tiger was also resistant to poison. It was indeed abnormal. In the 9th summit, Ning Xuemo placed a few more poisons in the stones. She even used the strongest anesthetic to lure the green tiger to smash into the stones. Every poisonous needle shot into the green tiger's head, but it did not cause any harm to the green tiger. The green tiger was still as majestic as ever, and it was even more energetic when it hit the rocks. Inside the array, stone fragments flew everywhere and dust filled the air. Ning Xuemo, who was inside the array, was choked to the point of having a headache. This green tiger didn't seem to be afraid of any poison. She couldn't waste her poison needles anymore. It seemed like she had to think of another way. Her gaze fell upon the green tiger's lush green fur, and her heart suddenly stirred. This fellow was so green. Was it of the wood attribute? Perhaps it was afraid of fire. She rummaged through her clothes and found a match. She lit it and took the risk to dash out. She flashed in front of the green tiger. The green tiger suddenly retreated and swiped at her with its paw. If it weren't for Ning Xuemo's quick reflexes, her hand would have been slapped off. But the wind from the green tiger still extinguished the fire from the match. Ning Xuemo didn't want to fight it head-on, so she left after giving it a try. Relying on the large stones, she once again escaped from the green tiger's pursuit. This fellow was most likely afraid of fire. Ning Xuemo came to this conclusion. There was a big tree in her array. It was luxuriant and tall. Ning Xuemo was as agile as a monkey. She quickly climbed up the tree and broke off a branch. The little boy in white was watching with great interest on another big tree. When he saw her break off a lush green branch, the corners of his lips curled up slightly. He was very smart and had already seen through Ning Xuemo's intention. She must have seen that the green tiger was afraid of fire and wanted to make a torch. Chapter 174. However, the tree trunk was growing just right. It was juicy and lush with green leaves. She only had a match in her hand. How could she light it? Was this little girl muddle-headed from being forced into a corner? The little boy looked refreshed as he watched. She actually attacked him when he was at his weakest and most powerless. She even interrupted his cultivation and caused his cultivation this year to be in vain. She even bit him. This was the price she had to pay for offending him. If it was someone else who offended him like this, they would have turned into ashes long ago. Actually, he still had some mercy for her. The little boy in white leaned against the tree lazily. He looked down at Ning Xuemo, who was busying herself, and suddenly felt that his long life was not so boring anymore. How would she start a fire? If she had fire psychokinesis, it would not be difficult. Usually, he would be able to set the surrounding trees on fire with a wave of his sleeve. However, this girl was obviously a psychokinesis trash. Before he could finish his thought, he suddenly saw Ning Xuemo's small hand holding onto the tree trunk in her hand. She closed her eyes slightly and was in the middle of channeling her energy. After a while, under the little boy's surprised gaze, the tree trunk turned yellow and dried up at a speed that was visible to the naked eye. The little boy suddenly narrowed his eyes. What kind of martial arts was this? It was as if this little girl used evil arts to absorb all the vitality of the tree trunk. This kind of martial arts, his handsome little face showed a trace of seriousness. He slowly straightened his body that was leaning against the tree trunk, and a trace of deep thought flashed across his eyes. Ning Xuemo was actually just experimenting. She had once absorbed all the spiritual energy from a crystal and turned it into a dried rod. Therefore, she used the same internal energy on the tree trunk as a last resort. As expected, it also turned into a dried rod. The green leaves that were originally on the dried rod had now turned into dried leaves. She used a match to light it up. After a while, a torch was already burning in her hand. When the fire was strong enough, she flew up again, and the blazing torch was like a burning sword, burning towards the body of the green tiger that was charging towards her. Boom! The green tiger couldn't dodge in time, and its fur began to burn as if it had been splashed with oil. Oh whoa! The green tiger raised its head and let out a mournful howl. Its entire body collapsed like a piece of paper and was burned to ashes in the blink of an eye. Ning Xuemo, she stared blankly at the small pile of ashes on the ground. She had already seen that this tiger was afraid of fire, but she did not expect it to be so afraid of fire. She thought that she would be able to get a few pieces of roasted tiger meat. There was only the smell of burnt leaves in the air. There was no meat aroma as she expected, and there was no psychokinesis crystal left behind by the tiger. There was only one possibility for such a situation to occur. This was not a real tiger, but a transformation of some kind of Tao technique. That ginseng baby. It seemed like that little thing hadn't run away and was still scheming against her. This little thing was quite vengeful. It didn't want to leave even after it ran away from her. It seemed like it was still unwilling to give up and was watching from the dark. Ning Xuemo's eyes slightly flashed as she circled around the place where the green tiger disappeared. Suddenly, she staggered and raised her hand to look at her palm. Her palm was still dripping with blood. A silver needle had been stabbed into her flesh at a slanted angle. Under the moonlight, the needle shone faintly. Damn it! She cursed under her breath. She raised her hand to pull out the silver needle and took out a small bottle. It seemed like she wanted to apply the medicine herself, but her fingers were trembling and she couldn't pour out the powder. Suddenly, her legs gave way and she fell straight down. Chapter 175. With a loud bang, her head hit a large rock. Her body trembled for a moment before she stopped moving. The boy in white was speechless. His long eyelashes fluttered as he looked at Ning Xuema, who was lying there motionless, as if she had been poisoned by her own poison. He didn't react for a long time. The little girl's head must have been injured. There was a pool of blood slowly forming under her head. The blood was dark purple. It was obvious that she had been poisoned. After all, the little girl was still young. She had hidden poison all over her body and had just gone through such a battle. It was very likely that she had been accidentally injured by her own poison needles. His gaze fell on the pool of blood. Judging from the color of the blood, the little girl had been poisoned quite severely. Would she die here? He crossed his arms and stared at Ning Xuema for a full quarter of an hour. Ning Xuema was still lying there, motionless. The wind blew her clothes, making her curled-up body look lonely and weak. It was as if a few more gusts of wind would blow her away. The boy in white watched for a long time. Suddenly, he used a leaf to fold a wolf and threw it down. It landed beside Ning Xuema and turned into a mighty and majestic wolf. That big wolf circled around Ning Xuema, huffing and puffing as it sniffed and sniffed. Suddenly, it bared its sharp fangs and bit Ning Xuema's calf. Fresh blood flowed out. The color of the blood was also dark purple. The wolf raised its head and howled. The howl echoed throughout the mountain. Ning Xuema was still lying there, motionless. It seemed that the little girl had really fainted. The white-clothed boy's figure moved. In the blink of an eye, he appeared in front of Ning Xuema and flicked his finger at the wolf. In the blink of an eye, the wolf turned back into a green leaf. He lowered his head and looked at Ning Xuema. He reached out his small hand and wanted to turn her over to take a look. At that moment, an unforeseen event happened. Ning Xuema's body suddenly leapt up like lightning, directly pouncing on the white-clothed boy. Her movements were abnormally fast, and her explosive power was extremely strong. This fierce pounce was comparable to the speed of light. The boy couldn't dodge in time and was pounced on by her. He was less than a meter tall, and Ning Xuema was a giant compared to him. He couldn't bear the weight of Ning Xuema's entire body. With a plop sound, he was directly pushed to the ground. Unfortunately, the back of his head also knocked against a piece of bluestone, causing him to see stars. At the same time, he felt a sudden chill, pain, and numbness in the joints of his limbs. Several silver needles had pierced into his body. His vision darkened and his entire body went numb. He only had time to say one thing: "If you kill me, you won't be able to leave the 9th summit." Then, he fainted. Ning Xuema, the dagger in her hand, was about to stab into the boy's heart, but his last sentence made her stop. She raised her hand and swallowed a pill. After panting for a moment, she lowered her eyes and looked at the little rascal that was firmly pressed under her body. She tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then, she took out all the silk thread she had on her. She tied the little guy up tightly. She had indeed pretended to be poisoned just to attract the little guy down. In order to make it look real, she had specially taken a poison pill. This kind of poison wouldn't take a person's life, but it would cause the blood vessels in the body to hurt a little. More importantly, this kind of poison would cause the blood to turn black and purple, as if it was highly toxic. This little ginseng child was really extraordinarily cautious. He even brought a wolf down to test her. Chapter 176. If it weren't for her strong mental strength and high endurance, she would have jumped up the moment the wolf circled around her, but she was also prepared. If the wolf really bit her vital parts, she would jump up and fight back. Fortunately, the boy didn't seem to want to take her life directly, so the wolf didn't bite her vital parts. She secretly gritted her teeth and endured it for a while. She managed to endure it. It was not until the boy came down and came to her side that she chose the best time to attack and succeeded in one fell swoop. It seems that this ginseng child's technique is a little stronger, his speed is a little faster, but his physical strength is average. Ning Xuema suffered such a big loss in the hands of this boy, naturally she would not be polite. Once she pounced on him, she would immediately use several anesthetic needles to paralyze him first. She originally wanted to end him. A ginseng child is a great tonic. If she killed him, perhaps he would not be in the form of a child, but in the form of a ginseng, then she would not taste too bloody. But the child's last sentence made her pause. Looking at the child's exquisite facial features, she was a little hesitant to kill him. Actually, she wasn't intimidated by his last sentence. Using Ning Xuema's own words, she wasn't someone who was scared. At this moment, her eyes fell on the back of the child's head, where bright red blood was gushing out. She subconsciously dipped her finger in it and brought it to her nose to smell it. Damn, does it have to be so realistic? A ginseng child can bleed, and the smell of the blood is no different from human blood. She looked again at the flower-like cinnabar mole between the child's eyebrows. A question finally emerged in her mind. Is this guy really a ginseng child? What if this cinnabar mole just happens to look like a ginseng flower? However, even if he's not a ginseng child, he shouldn't be a human, right? Whose child would be able to run all the way here? And he has such a good magical power that can turn beans into soldiers. He can fold something and turn it into a real animal. It's a bit like a Taoist technique. This little guy was obviously an expert. It was said that when a Taoist reached a certain level of cultivation, they could cultivate a nascent soul. The nascent soul could leave the body. Could this little kid be the nascent soul of some great god? Ning Xuema is shocked by her own deduction. She has read a lot of books about cultivation in this world, but there seems to be no such thing as yuanying. The concept of nascent soul was only mentioned in the Taoist scriptures of her own world. Furthermore, the book also said that although the nascent soul cultivated by a Taoist master was the size of a 1 or 2-year-old boy, its appearance would still be the original appearance. It was just that its size had shrunk by several sizes. On the other hand, this one had the appearance of a standard little doll. Her eyes were watery and tender, making people want to hug and kiss her. It took a certain amount of courage to kill him and eat his meat. She lowered her eyes to look at him again. TSK, he had actually changed his clothes in such a short time. He was no longer wearing a dudu. This white robe was quite nice, and it made his small face look even better. This little doll reminded her of Hubba in Monster Hunt for no reason. Hubba didn't look like a human. It was just a little cute, but it was likable and pitiful, and people couldn't bear to hurt it. Moreover, this little doll in front of her has the appearance of a standard human. Beautiful dolls are really likable, even if they know that he's a demon. When the little doll woke up, he found himself tied up like a dumpling and placed on a big rock. Chapter 177. When the baby woke up, he found himself tied up like a dumpling and placed on a big rock. Ning Xuema was very professional when it came to tying people up. Not only did she tie up his limbs, but she also tied up his fingers one by one. He couldn't even move his fingers, let alone make a spell. Ning Xuema was sitting not far away from him. There was a bonfire in front of her, and the blazing bonfire illuminated her little face. She seemed to have noticed that he had woken up, so she turned around and smiled at him. Under the moonlight, her 4 little white teeth were shining. "Little guy, how do you choose to die? Should I roast you or stew you?" The baby didn't struggle. He was silent for a moment. "Roasting is not nutritious, stewing is nutritious, but you don't have a pot." Ning Xuema was speechless. He was telling the truth. However, this baby was too calm. Was he sure that she wouldn't kill him? She was a little unhappy. She walked over and spun the knife in her hand. Roasting is not nutritious, but it's better than not eating at all. I'll just skewer you and roast you. I've roasted a suckling pig before, and it was delicious. I think roasting a ginseng baby won't be too bad. The baby pursed his lips and didn't say anything. Ning Xuema squatted in front of him and patted him with the handle of the knife. She smiled kindly. What do you think? Do you have any better suggestions? If not, we'll happily decide. The baby stared at her face with a pair of deep blue eyes. She looked at him with a smile, and there was a pair of dimples on each of her cheeks. She looked pure and kind, and even a little childish, but she was actually a cunning little devil. The baby's eyes were too deep, like the unfathomable deep sea. Ning Xuema looked at him for a moment, and her heart skipped a beat. She coughed and looked away. He pointed the knife at his little face and said, "Why don't I cut off 2 pieces of your pretty little face and roast them?" The little child's face was so delicate that it could be broken by blowing on it. When Ning Xuema's knife got a bit closer to his face, the little child subconsciously dodged, causing her knife to graze his face. Unexpectedly, drops of blood started to flow down his face. Ning Xuema was slightly taken aback. She quickly moved the knife back a little. If such a pretty little face was really scratched, it would be ugly. What a sin. The child did not seem to care about the wound on his face. His eyes flashed with a hint of a smile as he looked at her. That smile was very faint, so faint that Ning Xuema, who had been looking at him all this time, did not notice it. "Young lady." He opened his mouth, and his words were straightforward. "Let me go, and I will send you out of the 9th summit. Only a fool would believe you." Ning Xuema sat down on the spot. "Last time, you also said that you wouldn't run. In the end, you disappeared in the blink of an eye. You even schemed against me behind my back. Last time, you were too bold. You actually took liberties with me." Ning Xuema finally remembered that last time when she patted his dudu, she seemed to have accidentally patted between his legs. She coughed and smiled indifferently. She glanced at his lower body with ill intentions. "You're just a little bean. What's there to take liberties with? Is that thing as big as a bean sprout? The baby, this little girl's skin is too thick." He had lived for so many years, and this was the first time he saw such a thick-skinned little girl. Since he met this little girl, it seemed that there were several firsts. Chapter 178. This was the first time someone had broken through the array he had set up in the lake. It was also the first time he had been caught by someone. Furthermore, he was caught by a useless little girl. He had been through so many storms and waves, but he had actually failed miserably, not to mention others. Even he himself felt that it was a little funny. He glanced at her. In order to trick him, this little girl had really put in a lot of effort just now. There was still an egg-sized bruise on her forehead, which looked a little scary. Fortunately, this little girl liked to be clean, so she had already washed off the bloodstains on her forehead. Her whole face was white and clean, which was very pleasing to the eye. "As long as you don't touch me again, I won't run away. Without my help, you won't be able to go down the 9th peak. At the latest, you will be exposed to all kinds of magical beasts when the sun rises. Even if there are 10 of you, you will still be torn to pieces. They won't be as polite to you as I am. You're being polite to me." Ning Xuema snorted, "You let the tiger and wolf bite me." If she wasn't smart enough, she would have been torn to pieces by the green tiger. "They won't really hurt you." The boy slowly said, "Look at the place where your leg was bitten." Ning Xuema lowered her head and looked at the leg that was bitten by the wolf. Suddenly, she was stunned. The part of her leg that had been bitten looked bloody. There was a large laceration, and she had treated it herself. However, it only stopped the bleeding and she applied the self-made medicine. No matter how effective her medicine was, it was impossible for the wound to disappear in the blink of an eye. But now, she couldn't see any wounds on her leg, not even a small scar. Moreover, she couldn't feel any pain. You used an illusion to scare me just now. Ning Xuema put down her pants and her tone was much better. It seemed that this little guy didn't really want to kill her just now. The little doll didn't answer her nonsense. Instead, she asked, "Can you trust me now? You didn't really hurt me just now, but it doesn't mean that you won't now. You're too cunning, I'm worried." Ning Xuema was straightforward and directly expressed her concerns. "You're a cunning little girl, all right." The child pursed his thin lips, and his voice became even fainter. "There are still 6 hours before dawn. After 6 hours, the enchantment here will disappear. If you don't believe me, then just wait to be eaten by the magical beasts on this mountain. There was a legendary wizardry barrier here." Ning Xuema couldn't help but look around. The lake was like a mirror, and the shadows of the surrounding mountains were reflected in the lake. Together with the round moon in the sky, it was as beautiful as a fairyland. Ever since she entered the lake, other than the illusionary shadows she saw at the beginning, she did not see any magical beasts. It was not as dangerous as the legend said. Could it be because of the barrier? You set up this barrier. The baby closed his eyes and didn't answer. Ning Xuema thought for a moment, then suddenly hugged him and said, "Come down the mountain with me now." In the end, she was still worried about this little fellow. Didn't he have a way to deal with all kinds of magical beasts? Then she would take him and run away. If there was any danger, he would tell her automatically. "Little boy, you and I are in the same boat now. I can't run away, and I can't jump away from you. If there is any danger, you have to tell me. Otherwise, I'll be eaten by the magical beasts and you'll become their snack." She carried him and walked along the shore to the shortest mountain. The little boy was speechless. Chapter 179. That little child, he was tied up and lying in her arms. His posture was a little strange, but he didn't seem to care. He just looked at her and said, "Have you always been so distrustful of people?" This little girl was more than cautious when it came to people and things. Ning Xuema pursed her lips. As a secret agent, it was indeed difficult to trust anyone except for her own life and death companions. Because the price of trusting someone was only one word, death. That little child's lips twitched slightly. He stared at her face and said, "How can a declining young miss of a marquis mansion be so scheming?" Ning Xuema's arms stiffened slightly. She looked at him and asked, "You know my identity?" That little child answered casually, "I know." How did he know? Wasn't he a ginseng child who grew up in the mountains? Ning Xuema's eyes flashed with suspicion. That little child seemed to understand her doubts. He smiled and said, "Don't you think that I'm a ginseng immortal? Since I'm an immortal, I can predict." Ning Xuema smiled. She smiled with evil intentions and said, "Then you can predict when I'll stew you in the pot." That little child. He shut his mouth. Although Ning Xuema was carrying someone, she still walked very fast in order to escape. She climbed the mountain very professionally. The trees on the mountain were a little like the trees in the south. The trunks were thick and the crowns were huge. Countless aerial roots hung down from the crowns and pierced into the ground. It was like countless dragons sucking water. It was a magnificent sight. These trees were similar in appearance. They all had palm-sized leaves. Each leaf grew upwards and was dense. The moonlight was like water, splashing down and shining on these leaves, shining with a faint silver light. This small mountain was densely packed with such trees. Ning Xuema walked among them, as if she was walking in a palm forest. That feeling was indescribably strange. "What kind of trees are these?" Ning Xuemo asked. The tree was full of hands and it felt so scary. That child's long eyelashes were closed on his face, as if he was already asleep. He didn't have any intention to answer. It seemed like little Wimp was still angry that she didn't untie him and was still angry at her. Ning Xuemo stopped asking him and continued to walk forward. Fortunately, although the leaves of these trees looked strange, there was nothing strange about them. They did not emit poisonous gas, nor did they eat people like the cannibal trees. Below the tree were jagged mountain rocks. These rocks looked like shale and were stacked in layers. It was a little uncomfortable to step on them. Ning Xuemo was actually a little puzzled. Generally, coniferous forests grew on high mountains, especially those that grew in the crevices of rocks. Most of them were pine and cypress. However, the trees here had so many leaves and so many aerial roots. They were clearly the characteristics of a tropical rainforest. The climate here was cool and dry, so it shouldn't be suitable for such trees to grow. This strange place even defied the laws of nature. She complained in her heart as she walked. It was difficult to walk on the rugged ground, and she accidentally kicked the aerial root of a big tree. This aerial root was relatively small, and when it was broken by her kick, a faint transparent liquid actually flowed out from it. Ning Xuemo was a little thirsty from walking, so when she saw the liquid, she wanted to drink it to replenish her energy. She was still very cautious. She first used a silver needle to test it. After confirming that it wasn't poisonous, she then picked up the aerial root and drank it. This liquid was actually very sweet. After drinking the first mouthful, she wanted to drink a second mouthful. In just a short moment, the liquid in the aerial root was completely sucked dry. Chapter 180. She still wanted more, so she took out a short knife and wanted to cut open another aerial root to drink. With your physique, you can only drink this much. If you drink more, it will be harmful to you, the boy suddenly said. Ning Xuemo glanced at him with a doubtful look. She was only half full, and the more she drank, the more she wanted to drink more. You can choose not to believe me, but don't blame me for not reminding you if you drink until you vomit blood, the boy said lightly and closed his eyes again. How could she vomit blood after drinking such sweet water? It was just liquid from the aerial roots, not ginseng, deer antler, or Ganoderma lucidum. Why would she vomit blood after drinking it? Ning Xuemo looked at the aerial roots again and suddenly had an idea. The top of the aerial roots were connected to the densest part of the leaves, and the stalks of the leaves were basically growing near the aerial roots. She raised her head and looked at the moon in the sky. Could it be that the palm-shaped leaves were absorbing the essence of the moon? Then, the essence would be transferred to the aerial roots, and the aerial roots would be inserted into the cracks of the rocks. Moreover, the aerial roots were all facing the same direction. Ning Xuemo remembered that when she first entered the forest, she saw a thin stream outside the forest. The stream was obviously flowing towards the big lake. I know. The water in the big lake was formed by the water from the aerial roots. The boy's eyelashes moved slightly, but he didn't say anything. Ning Xuemo was still a little regretful. If I had known, I would have drunk more water from the big lake. The trees on each mountain were transferring the essence of the moon into the big lake. The big lake was simply a nourishing soup. No wonder you had to sit there and absorb the nutrients. She thought of the layers of green platforms again. A question flashed through her mind. Was there any ginseng that grew in water? The big green platform didn't look like ginseng leaves. She couldn't help but reach out and touch the boy's tender face. No wonder you are so beautiful and your skin is so smooth. It is nourished by the essence of the sun and the moon. The boy's eyebrows twitched slightly, but he was too lazy to open his eyes. His little mouth was slightly closed, and under the moonlight, it looked like a crystal-clear flower with dew. Ning Xuema couldn't help but lower her head and kiss his lips again. The child's body stiffened slightly. Before he could do anything, Ning Xuema raised her head and said with a smile, "It tastes good." As expected of someone who grew up absorbing the essence of the sun and moon. The small child. The ice lake in his eyes seemed to crack a little. "Do you always like to kiss strange men?" His voice seemed to carry a chill. He had already been kissed by her twice in such a short period of time. "Little fellow, you're wrong. Firstly, you and I are not strangers. Secondly, and most importantly, you're not a man yet." Ning Xuema raised her hand and pinched his face. "You're just a little being, a baby. You can't even be considered a boy. In our time, everyone was close to children." "Your era." "Which era?" The child had obviously caught on to her words. Ning Xuema didn't take it to heart. She said casually, it's the era I lived in my previous life." It was very civilized and advanced. Ning Xuema wasn't a talkative person, but she had been trapped in the mountains for so long. It was rare for her to meet someone she could talk to. This child probably didn't come out often and wouldn't reveal her secret. She briefly talked about the civilization of her era, the scenery, the system, the weapons, the mobile phone, the internet. The more she talked, the more she missed it. She didn't feel anything when she was in that era, but once she left, she couldn't bear to leave. Chapter 181. The little baby listened to her talk about the era without saying a word. He was a good audience, but he looked at her thoughtfully and then closed his eyes slightly, as if he was sensing something. When she finally closed her mouth, he said, "You don't have a fever, so you're not talking nonsense. Your imagination is good." Ning Xuema was speechless. He obviously didn't believe her. That's right, in her era, although time travel dramas were everywhere and everyone knew about it. However, if someone really swore that he or she was from ancient times, most people would not believe it and would only treat the other party as a lunatic or a psychopath. Moreover, in this time and space, such a statement was undoubtedly a fantasy. It didn't matter if he didn't believe it or not. She just wanted to find a trash can to talk to. She didn't care if this trash can understood her or not. She lifted his little body up and didn't care. "Then you can take it that I'm talking in my sleep." The little baby seemed to be a little talkative. "Who taught you your martial arts?" Ning Xuema didn't want to explain so much, so she simply said something more reliable that no one dared to verify, "Di Zun." The little baby was slightly stunned and looked at her with a smile. "Are you sure it's him?" "I'm sure, everyone thinks so." Then tell me what he looks like." "You know him too?" Ning Xuema glanced at him. "Yes." The little baby answered concisely. "Then do you know him?" "Little girl, I'm the one asking you now." The little baby's face was tense, and the aura around him was extremely strong. The surrounding temperature seemed to drop. Ning Xuema was not afraid of him and narrowed her eyes. "Little guy, I'm the one asking you now. You're my captive, so you have to answer whatever I ask you." The little baby's eyes drooped slightly. "Okay, I'm your captive, so I'll answer you first. I know him, and our friendship is not shallow." Ning Xuema opened her eyes wide and blurted out, "You're so young, but you know that old faker?" After saying that, he felt that he had made a mistake. This child looked young, but based on the number of years he had cultivated, he should be quite old. Perhaps he really did know that venerable emperor. Didn't the rumors say that Di Zun would occasionally come to the 9th summit? The veins on the kid's forehead bulged. Old faker. His tone sounded like he was grinding his teeth as he looked at her meaningfully. You've got guts. This shows that you were lying just now. If he was your master, would you dare to call him that? Ning Xuema had already thought of what to say, so she immediately began to fool him. Little guy, you don't understand, do you? Old Faker is actually an honorific title in our world. Old is lousy, God is immortal, and Rod. Rod has an even more extraordinary meaning. When addressing a real pillar, we would say that he is a white jade pillar that holds up the sky. A pillar is actually a rod. Venerable sovereigns were of noble status and were the spiritual support of the people of this continent. Therefore, calling him Old Faker is an honorific. The little baby looked at her speechlessly for a long time, then closed his eyes and stopped talking. Ning Xuema was somewhat puzzled. You're not going to ask me what he looks like anymore. Weren't children very curious? This little baby's curiosity was seriously lacking. You really know. The little baby's interest was waning, and it was obvious that he was not interested. Chapter 182. Of course I do. His whole body was frighteningly cold. He was dressed in white, and his black hair almost reached his ankles. He wore an ice mask on his face, and his figure was tall and straight. Ning Xuema described the appearance of Di Zun in the hall. The child looked at her again. I couldn't tell that you really saw him. Of course, he taught me martial arts. As far as I know, Di Zun doesn't accept female disciples. You lie without blinking. There are exceptions to everything, aren't there? He doesn't intend to break this exception. The child's tone was very certain. You say it as if you know him very well. Come, since you're so familiar with him, you must know his true appearance. Tell me, what does his face look like under the mask? Walking was boring, so Ning Xuema decided to gossip. Why should I tell you? The child didn't buy it. You haven't actually seen his true appearance, right? You're exaggerating. But I can't blame you. I heard that no one has seen it. I guess he doesn't want anyone to see it. After all, he's so famous that everyone worships him like a god. He also has an awe-inspiring immortal aura. If his face is wrinkled, how disillusioned would it be? I understand. The child's lips twitched slightly. Wrinkled. You're slandering him behind his back. Aren't you afraid that he'll punish you if he finds out? He can annihilate your soul with a casual move. I'm just telling the truth. If his face wasn't so ugly, why would he always wear a mask? His hair is very beautiful, so he always keeps it so long. He's afraid that people can't see it. His hair is like a waterfall, and he looks very young. The child was speechless. Her reasoning was too strong, and he was defeated by her. He didn't want to discuss this useless topic with her anymore. He looked at her with a faint smile, then closed his eyes and didn't speak anymore. Ning Xuema felt that his smile seemed to have a deeper meaning, but she couldn't figure it out at the moment. Although the little doll in her arms looked like a child, the way he spoke gave people an unfathomable feeling, causing her heart to inexplicably turn cold and her scalp numb. Originally, she had some doubts about whether he was a ginseng child, but now she was almost 70 to 80% sure. How could a real child be so mature? At this time, the full moon in the sky was already slanting to the west. Ning Xuema knew that in at most 4 hours, the sun would rise. She finally reached the top of the mountain and looked down at the other side of the mountain. Then, she was stunned. There was a large lake at the foot of the mountain. The size of the lake and the surrounding scenery were exactly the same as the lake she had just left. Did she go in the wrong direction? Ning Xuema ran to the other side and looked down. Her head buzzed. The scenery at the foot of the mountain was the same. Was this the uncanny workmanship of nature, deliberately creating a mirror-like scene, or had she encountered a ghost? Hey, what's going on? Ning Xuema wanted to wake up the baby in her arms. The baby closed his eyes and seemed to have fallen asleep. He didn't seem to have any intention of responding to her. If you don't open your eyes, I'm going to cut your face with a knife. Ning Xuema threatened him and pointed the knife at his little face. The baby still turned a deaf ear to her. Ning Xuema sneered, "Are you really not afraid? Ah, then don't blame me for being ruthless. I'm going to draw a turtle on your left cheek and a bird on your right cheek. I guarantee that you'll be beautiful in front of your own kind, and they'll worship you." Chapter 183. The child seemed to have been defeated by her threats and finally opened his eyes. However, what he said almost angered Ning Xuema to death. "There's a wizardry barrier here. It's the same no matter where you go. Before the wizardry barrier disappears, you won't be able to get out." Ning Xuema rarely got angry, but at this moment, she almost gritted her teeth. "You knew it would be like this? Why didn't you say so earlier?" He caused her to carry a child and climbed the mountain for almost 2 hours. "You didn't ask. I thought you were bored and wanted to climb the mountain for fun." The child's answer was very annoying. Ning Xuema was speechless. She really wanted to throw this child onto a rock and smash him to death. In fact, she did that, but she didn't smash him. She threw him. She threw him to the side of a mountain rock and sat down on another mountain rock. "You said that you would send me out of the 9th peak." Ning Xuema's voice was gloomy. "Yes, I did say that, but only if you let me go." The little doll answered slowly. The topic returned to the old topic. Ning Xuema sneered, "Do you think I'm stupid? If I let you go, you'll run away again. Maybe you'll even plot against me behind my back. It's understandable to fall in the same place once, but if you fall a second time, you'll be an idiot." She sat for a moment and stood up again. She simply picked up the child like a cloth bag and threw him behind her. Then, she found a few thin vines and tied him directly to her back. "If I can't get out, you can't escape either. You'll have to live and die with me." The child sighed softly and didn't say anything else. Ning Xuema no longer paid attention to him and walked north with large strides. She had always had a strong sense of direction. She clearly remembered that she climbed up from the south slope, so even if the scenery at the north slope was the same as the other side, it might just be an illusion. She was heading in the right direction. It wasn't convenient for her to walk when she was carrying the child, but now that he was on her back, she walked very quickly. The child on her back opened his eyes to take a look. From his angle, he could only see Ning Xuema's fair neck. This little girl had the spirit of not giving up until all hope was gone, which made him have a whole new level of respect for her. He closed his eyes again and placed one of his ears on Ning Xuema's back. He could hear her steady heartbeat. In such an unknown and hopeless situation, her mind is still so calm. This child is a promising talent. Although she is a psychokinesis trash, but that does not mean she will not achieve anything in the future. He pursed his lips slightly. Was he thinking of cherishing talent again? It seemed like he hadn't felt this way for many years. His eyes were closed the entire time. The moonlight shone on his body and flowed on his robes, giving him a faint halo of light. Ning Xuema, who had been striding forward, naturally did not notice the subtle changes of the child on her back. She also did not notice that the silk threads she used to tie him were slowly disappearing as if they were melting. When Ning Xuema walked into the forest where palm leaves grew, after walking for a while, she finally concluded that she had indeed encountered something similar to a ghost wall. She found the aerial route that was broken by her kick, and even found the mark she made on the tree to prevent herself from getting lost. This time, she completely gave up and simply returned to the lake. Since she couldn't get out of this enchantment, she might as well rest here and wait for the enchantment to disappear before leaving. Chapter 184. Since she couldn't get out of this enchantment, she might as well rest here and wait for the enchantment to disappear before leaving. She wouldn't foolishly rush around and do useless things. The lake water rippled, and the bonfire she had made before was still there. There were even some sparks on the bonfire. Little thing, you win. Ning Xuema sat down on a big rock by the lake. Let's meditate together and wait for dawn. Tomorrow, when the enchantment disappears, the magic beast will appear. If it wants to eat me, I'll throw you out as bait. Before she could finish her threat, she suddenly heard the boy behind her shout, "Be careful, back off." It was almost a subconscious reaction. Before Ning Xuema's brain could process what was going on, her feet had already flown back several meters like the wind. Splash! With a splash, a black shadow rushed out of the water and landed on the shore like a storm. The splash was several feet high, and it landed right where Ning Xuema had been resting. Obviously, if Ning Xuema hadn't reacted quickly and retreated in time, she would have been attacked by this thing and become its food. As this thing landed on the ground, a ferocious aura covered the sky and earth. Even Ning Xuema, who was used to seeing the world, shivered when she saw its appearance. What kind of magic beast was this? A Komodo dragon? No, a Komodo dragon didn't have horns, and it wasn't that big. This thing in front of her was comparable to a Tyrannosaurus rex. Damn, were the dinosaurs not extinct in this world? The magic beast was covered in green scales, and it did look similar to a Komodo dragon, except that it had a pair of knife-like horns on its head, and its bloody mouth was full of sharp teeth. Ning Xuema didn't doubt that if she threw the baby on her back at it, it would definitely be bitten into pieces. Ning Xuema took a few steps back like a whirlwind. Hey, little thing, didn't you say that there was an enchantment here and the beasts couldn't come in? What kind of thing is this? Before she could finish grumbling, the monster opened its mouth and shot countless sharp green arrows at her like a storm. Fuck, is it really okay to use a killer move right from the start? Ning Xuema's figure flashed as fast as a flash of light. She immediately hid behind a large tree. Puff, 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 puff. Like a torrential rain, those green arrows shot directly into the trunk of the big tree. Boom! With a loud sound, the big tree was actually broken in half and fell to the ground with a loud crash. Ning Xuema had no choice but to dodge again. Just as she dodged the falling tree, a sharp whistling sound came from the air again. The green arrow shot by the strange dragon was heading straight for her. Ning Xuema was speechless. She almost suspected that there was an arrow launcher hidden in this fellow's mouth. There were no internal organs in his stomach, only arrows. How could he fire wave after wave without stopping? With her current kung fu, she couldn't fight head-on. She could only use her best qigong to dodge. Fortunately, there were many big rocks in this place, so she had more places to hide. This strange dragon's arrows were extremely powerful. No matter what it hit, it would directly shatter into pieces. Countless big rocks were turned into rubble under the rain of arrows. Smoke and dust rose high into the air, covering the sky and the sun. Ning Xuema practically used all of her strength, yet she was still battered and exhausted from dodging. She used all her energy to dodge the waves of attacks from the strange dragon. She didn't realize that her qigong had greatly improved compared to before. It could really be said that her qigong was as fast as lightning, comparable to the teleportation of a psychic. Chapter 185. She had never run so fast in her previous life. Little girl, you probably broke a little of the barrier when you came in just now, and this guy took advantage of it. Oh right, you can't just keep dodging, the boy behind her said. Nonsense. Ning Xuemo rolled her eyes secretly. Of course, she knew that. The problem was that the guy's attack was too fast and too dense. She couldn't fight back at all. Moreover, she only had a short knife in her hand and some poison needles and anesthetic needles. She had used the poison needles and anesthetic needles when she was dodging just now, but they were useless. The guy's scales were harder than steel. Her needles were shattered when they hit the surface of the dragon's scales. She couldn't even pierce its skin at all. Ning Xuemo almost couldn't breathe under the attacks of the strange dragon. Although her qigong was good, her physical strength was still a little weak, not to mention that she was carrying a child on her back. Not long after, her clothes were drenched in sweat. You can leave me behind. It'll be easier for you, the boy suggested again. I'm not leaving you behind. I can use you to block the arrows at critical times. Ning Xuemo was annoyed and her words were vicious. However, she carefully avoided her back every time she dodged, so that the child on her back wouldn't be accidentally hurt. She was actually a little regretful. If she had known earlier, she would have untied the child on her back first. At least he had magic power. Perhaps he could use magic power to block the strange dragon's attack. Now, his limbs were tightly bound by her. Even his fingers were tied together, so he couldn't make any hand seals or chant spells. He didn't even have the ability to protect himself. If she threw him out now, he would definitely become a snack for the strange dragon. You can't bear to feed me to the dragon. The little fellow's breath was like orchids by her ear. That cold breath brushed against her ear, causing her body to go numb for no reason. She almost couldn't dodge the strange dragon's arrow rain attack. A green arrow pierced through her trouser leg. How mysterious. It almost pierced her calf. Shut up, little brat. I'm not even willing to eat myself. How can I give it to it? Ning Xuemo dodged another wave of arrows and answered in annoyance. Under the torrential attacks of the strange dragon, she had to be on full alert and still had to dodge in a panic. How could she be distracted while talking? Another wave of arrows rained down on her, but there wasn't a single boulder around her that she could hide behind. Seeing the dark green arrows coming at her like shooting stars, she couldn't dodge in time. Her heart turned cold. She was finished. This time, I'm afraid I'll become a hedgehog. Naturally, she wasn't willing to be shot like a pig. She steeled her heart and used the dagger in her hand to deflect the arrows that were aimed at her vital parts. She didn't care anymore, she would block as many as she could. Suddenly, a golden light flashed in front of her, and a pale golden crescent-shaped protective shield appeared in front of her. Those green arrows hit the protective shield, and with a chi-chi sound, the green arrows shattered into dust. Ning Xuemo, who saved her at this time? Where did the reinforcements come from? She subconsciously wanted to turn around, but a breath lingered in her ear. Don't be distracted. Continue to use your footwork to get closer to the water. The voice belonged to the child. Finally, a question flashed in Ning Xuemo's mind. He was tied up like a dumpling on her back. Since when could he be so close to her ear? She was so focused on dealing with the strange dragon that she didn't notice the strange behavior of the child behind her. Based on her senses, she knew that the child behind her had half of his body propped up. His two little hands were even placed on top of her head. Chapter 186. You. Ning Xuemo almost threw him away. However, before she could do so, the pale golden shield had already disappeared, and the strange dragon's arrow rain shot over once again. Ning Xuema had no choice but to suppress all her questions and use her special qigong footwork to evade the arrows. Her movements were like a ray of moonlight, drifting back and forth amidst the rain of arrows. Her dodging was extremely dangerous, and there were a few times where she was almost hit by the rain of arrows. Hey! Set up another protective shield. Ning Xuema shouted in the midst of the chaos. You can only set it up once every 15 minutes, the boy behind her answered. Damn! There's a cooldown time. Don't you have any other tricks? This ginseng child had lived in the 9th peak for so long, he must have some tricks up his sleeve, right? Otherwise, he would have become a demonic beast snack long ago. I do, but I can't use it right now. The boy's voice sounded a little regretful. How did you manage to live for so long? It's a miracle that you didn't get eaten by demonic beasts. Ning Xuema couldn't help but complain. This world doesn't lack miracles. For example, a useless person like you can also make it to the 9th peak. Be careful. Get close to the water, I have another trick. Because the dragon came out from the water, Ning Xuema was a little scared of the lake and stayed far away from it. However, the dragon kept blocking in front of her. It was 100 times harder for her to get close to it than to stay away from the lake. Hey, is that trick of yours effective? Don't tell me it's going to be over after blocking it again. That's an attack spell. As for its effect, you'll know after you try it. The boy's words were simple and clear. He couldn't guarantee anything. Ning Xuema was speechless. Forget it. She couldn't just keep dodging like this. Maybe the boy's last trick would work. Let's take the risk. She began to test the waters. While dodging the arrows, she moved closer to the lake. The dragon's body looked huge, but its movements were very agile. It kept chasing after Ning Xuema, not giving her a chance to rest. Ning Xuema fought with it for another half an hour before she finally got around its huge body and rushed to the lakeside. She prayed to the heavens that there wouldn't be a second dragon in the lake. Otherwise, she would be attacked from the front and back, and she would be dead for sure. Make your move. Make your move. Ning Xuema almost fell into the lake when she dodged at the last moment. She couldn't help but shout loudly. She suddenly felt the weight on her back lighten, and the boy who was lying on her shoulders suddenly disappeared. Ning Xuema's heart sank. Was this little thing taking advantage of the opportunity to escape through the water? After all, she had found him in the lake in the first place. This little bastard is not loyal at all. The strange dragon's attacks were too concentrated and fierce. Ning Xuema didn't even have time to complain or even look back. Seeing that another wave of arrows was coming, she could no longer retreat. If she retreated any further, she would fall directly into the lake. This strange dragon was an aquatic creature. If she fell into the water, she definitely wouldn't be its opponent. Ning Xuema subconsciously wanted to dodge to the left, but a bright blue light flashed in front of her eyes. A transparent water-colored cover directly covered her inside. The green arrows rained down on the cover, but the cover only lightly swayed. All the arrows fell to the ground, and not a single one managed to penetrate it. Her heart skipped a beat. That ginseng child finally made his move. Didn't he only have one attack left? With a protective barrier around her, she finally had time to look back. When she did, her eyes couldn't help but widen. Chapter 187. That little ginseng child stood in the air, his two small hands forming a seal in front of his chest. His silver hair was like water satin, fluttering around his body. The waves rolled like the tide, surrounding his body. The blue waves set off his white clothes, making him look as beautiful as a painting. However, what surprised Ning Xuema was not this. She was surprised by the little child's aura. It was rare to see such a majestic aura. That inexplicably strong pressure made Ning Xuema tremble. He was clearly a little child who was not even 2 years old, but at this moment, he had the aura of a mountain. Even the almost berserk strange dragon forgot to attack. It was so nervous that its eyes widened and its entire body tensed up. The little child suddenly pointed his white fingers forward. A few sparkling lake blue ice blades whizzed out and shot directly into the dragon's neck. There was no blood, and there were no wounds on the surface of its skin. However, the dragon let out a shrill cry and jumped into the air. Bang! With a loud explosion, the strange dragon suddenly exploded into several pieces in the air. Blood splattered everywhere, and it looked like a rain of blood. Ning Xuema was originally standing there to watch the show. She was not prepared for the sudden disappearance of the water shield around her. She could not dodge in time and was drenched in blood. Ning Xuema was speechless. She wiped the blood off her face and looked at the little child with an unfriendly expression. This little bastard. Couldn't he wait for the rain of blood to finish before he removed the shield? Splash! With a splash, the little child, who was originally floating in the air, fell into the water and sank to the bottom without even a splash. Was he exhausted after using such a powerful move? That's right, for such a small person to use such a ferocious move, it was reasonable for him to be exhausted. Ning Xuema turned and jumped into the water. After a while, she found him underwater. After the little boy fell into the water, he was actually meditating. His eyes were tightly shut, as if he had fainted. Ning Xuema was afraid that he would choke, so she reached out to pull him up. Unexpectedly, the little fellow moved half a foot away from her in the water and said, "Don't worry about me. Wash yourself first." Ning Xuema was still covered in the beast's blood. Although she jumped into the water, the blood didn't wash off immediately. The lake water around her was dyed red by her. She had jumped down to save him, but he despised her. It seemed that the little guy was a neat freak, that's right. Most people who like to wear white are misophobic, and some of them are even very misophobic. For example, the venerable Dizun had to use a handkerchief to hold her wrist. Although Ning Xuema knew that this little guy was not young, she could not help but choose to tolerate his baby face. She did not want to lower herself to the same level as a child. She glanced at the baby who was still in the water, but had already moved far away from the area she was in. She turned around and swam up. This little thing seemed to be aquatic and could speak normally in the water. Obviously, he wouldn't drown to death. She didn't have to worry about him for now and cleaned herself up first. She was also uncomfortable with the sticky blood all over her body. But before that, she had to get the magic dragon's crystal out first. Now, Ning Xuema was very professional at extracting crystals from the magic beast's body. Although the magic dragon's body was blown into pieces, the crystal in its body was still intact. It was not damaged at all. It was sparkling and green like a piece of jade. Ning Xuema used her hand to hold one end of the crystal. Like last time, she used the indescribable power in her body again. Chapter 188. As the color of the green crystal gradually faded, Ning Xuema also felt as if there were countless electric currents surging through her body. Wherever they went, she felt incomparably carefree. She couldn't help but circulate the power in her body a little faster. After a moment, she suddenly felt the electric currents rushing towards her like a torrent. Her whole body suddenly hurt, and all her veins were in pain as if they were about to explode. Even the blue veins on his forehead bulged and popped out. She was shocked and subconsciously wanted to slow down the speed of the suction in her body, but she didn't expect that the power wouldn't listen to her at all. Instead, it circulated faster and faster. She felt that her body was like a balloon that was being blown up without limit, as if it would explode in the next moment. This was the first time Ning Xuema experienced this feeling. This feeling was unprecedentedly terrifying, and she couldn't help but scream. Behind her, there was the sound of water splashing. Following that, Ning Xuema only felt that the back of her head was touched by a cold stream of air. She cried out in pain, and her body went limp as she fell to the ground and fainted. A white figure floated to her side and looked down at her. Ning Xuema was still covered in blood. She had planned to clean herself after absorbing the power of the crystal, but she didn't expect to encounter such a situation. At this moment, her blood-stained clothes were tightly stuck to her body, and one could clearly see her skin trembling. Her skin seemed to be hiding countless violent little snakes that were moving up and down. It seemed that her blood vessels would burst at any time, and it looked extremely frightening. Ning Xuema was really unconscious this time. She didn't see that there was already a man standing in front of her, a man in white. His wide white robe was like frost under the cold moon, and his silver hair fluttered behind him like a curtain. His deep blue eyes were like the deepest ice lake, rippling under the moonlight. One look from him seemed to be able to freeze one's blood vessels. His facial features were like the most perfect jade carving in the hands of God. Any adjectives to describe him were pale and powerless. The moment he appeared, the moon in the sky seemed to be ashamed of its inferiority. It hid into the clouds and hid half of its face. The man stood beside Ning Xuema, his white robe fluttering in the wind, fluttering in Ning Xuema's ears. His sleeves fluttered in the wind, as if an immortal had entered his dreams. This man was so beautiful that even the fairy of the Jade Lake would feel ashamed of her inferiority. She didn't dare to stand side by side with him. If this face was revealed to the world, all the women would go crazy for it, and all the men would want to commit suicide by jumping into a river. Even if he didn't commit suicide, he was still a homosexual. What was even rarer was that although this person's appearance was extremely beautiful, there wasn't the slightest trace of femininity. His entire body seemed to be shrouded in clouds and mist. He was clearly standing right in front of them, yet they couldn't see him clearly. He was unfathomable. His temperament was extremely indifferent and cold, as if he didn't care about anything, and nothing could make him care about anything. He lowered his eyes and looked at the filthy Ning Xuema lying on the ground. His brows furrowed slightly. It was obvious that he despised the filth on her body. However, if he continued to ignore her, her life would immediately be in danger. She would self-destruct just like that strange dragon and lose her life here. Idiot! He softly spat out 2 words and bent down to help Ning Xuema sit up. Inevitably, his hands were stained with blood again. His fingertips curled slightly, as if he wanted to use some kind of spell to clean her up. However, after a slight pause, as if he had some scruples, he gave up. His fingertips emitted a faint white light. Chapter 189. His fingertips emitted a faint white light, and he tapped Ning Xuema's body like a whirlwind. Wherever he tapped, the boiling blood in her body gradually calmed down and returned to normal. After pressing all the major acupoints on her body, her flushed little face finally returned to normal a little. He exhaled softly and pulled her 2 small hands over. Because she had just extracted the crystal from the devil dragon's body, her small hands were covered in blood and dirt. Her small hands were extremely dirty. The man in white frowned again and finally couldn't help but use a small cleaning spell to clean her small hands. Ning Xuema had been very busy in the past 2 days. She often fought and killed. There were 2 large blood blisters on her palms, which she pricked with a silver needle. Now, the blood was gone, but the 2 traces of the blisters were still there. They were uneven to the touch. The man in white glanced at the blisters on her palms and then looked at the bruise on her forehead. Although this little girl was young, she had a strong spirit. She was also willing to pay a big price. What kind of living environment did she have to have such a character? His palms touched her small hands, and he closed his eyes slightly. After a while, waves of faint green light gushed out from Ning Xiuma's palms and directly entered the man's body through his palms. The man's white robe fluttered, as if there was a strong wind blowing around him. After a while, the rampaging power in Ning Xiuma's body finally calmed down. Her flushed face also completely returned to normal. The man in white let go of her hands and put her in a cross-legged sitting position. Only then did he let go of her. Normally, if a person was unconscious, they wouldn't be able to sit still even if they were in a sitting position. However, the way the man put her in a sitting position was a bit strange. The pressure points were evenly distributed. After he let go of her, she still sat there calmly even though she was unconscious, as if she was meditating. The man in white picked up the crystal rod that she dropped on the ground. The end of the crystal was already a bit white. It was obviously caused by Ning Xiuma absorbing the psychokinesis on it. He looked at the crystal over and over again and shook his head slightly. This little girl was still too inexperienced after all. Even if she had a special cultivation technique, she shouldn't be so greedy. Her small body's endurance was limited, but she had rashly absorbed the energy from the crystal of a level 8 telekinesis magical beast. It was like a small stream forcibly absorbing the power of the sea. It would be strange if it did not overflow and did not collapse. She was already very lucky that her blood vessels didn't burst. Ning Xiuma's body was still trembling slightly. That was the after effect of almost exploding her blood vessels. She still needed the nourishment of a master's psychokinesis to completely recover. Although she was unconscious, there was still a pained expression on her face. Her eyebrows were knitted together, and it was obvious that she was still in discomfort. If she didn't recuperate in time, her body would be completely crippled. Even if he could leave the mountain alive, he would have to spend the rest of his life in bed. The white-clothed man stood still for a moment. Then, he let out an almost inaudible sigh. He raised his palms, and a faint white light lifted Ning Xiuma into the air. Then, he threw her into the water with a splash. Her tattered clothes were casually pulled off by a pair of slender jade-like hands, revealing her white sheep's petite body. Ning Xiuma was in a coma, and she didn't know that she had been stripped naked in the water. Secret, not secret, things that shouldn't be seen by others, things that should be seen by others, everything was exposed in front of the white-clothed man's eyes. Because Ning Xiuma had been consciously recuperating these days, her small body was showing signs of puberty. Chapter 190. Her skin was much fairer and smoother than before, and her breasts had finally swelled up a little. If an ordinary man saw such a charming scene in front of him, his heart would probably be moved and his blood would boil. However, this man in white obviously wouldn't. To him, the small body in front of him was no different from looking at streaky pork. He floated by her side and used his palms to clean her thoroughly. Although he was strong, it was obvious that he had never served anyone before. When he was cleaning Ning Xiuma, he didn't know how to control his strength. In the end, her small body was clean, and not a trace of blood could be found. However, he was also careless and left many light green finger marks on her body. Halfway through, Ning Xiuma's eyelashes fluttered twice, as if she was about to wake up. The man looked at the two of them at that moment, and then decisively added another slap to the back of her neck. As a result, Ning Xiuma became even more dizzy and wouldn't wake up for a while. He almost cleaned the space under her fingernails before he stopped and carried her ashore. Her own clothes were dirty and torn, and he obviously didn't intend to let her wear them. He felt in his sleeve and took out a small bag. His fingers clamped in the small bag and took out a set of snow-white robes. He didn't care about anything else and put it on for her. This white robe was also strange. When he took it out, it was a mature man's robe. After he put it on the petite Ning Xuemo, it actually shrank rapidly and quickly fit her body. Her long hair was wet and messy, and it draped over her shoulders. It didn't look compatible with the robe at all. The man in white was obviously a perfectionist, and he didn't like this. Thus, he took out a toothbrush and combed her hair. He wasn't used to serving people, so his actions were a little stiff. From time to time, he would pull a few strands of her hair. Fortunately, Ning Xuemo was still unconscious, or else she would have grimaced in pain. Once her hair was combed, it was very smooth. The man in white combed her hair a few times. His fingers curled, and he actually subconsciously combed her hair into a flower bun. He also conveniently pinned her hair with a pearl hairpin. After he finished combing her hair, he was stunned for a moment. He looked at her hair bun, then looked at his hands, and a strange look flashed through his eyes. He had never taken care of a girl's hair. In fact, he was too lazy to even take care of his own hair. Usually, he only used a gemstone headband to tie it up. She didn't expect him to be able to comb her hair into such a beautiful bun in such a short time. Was this talent? He once again sized her up. The current Ning Xuemo was like a freshly baked white pancake, clean and without a speck of dust. This time, he was finally satisfied. He sat down on a large rock and lifted his hands to hold her in his arms. The petite and exquisite girl was actually very compatible with his arms. He actually felt very comfortable when he held her. She was very obedient when she was unconscious, and her arms and legs were moved by him. In a short moment, he had arranged her into a posture of a child sitting on a lotus. Then, his palms held her small hands in his palms. Then, he closed his eyes and began to heal her damaged meridians. A faint white light emitted from his body, and like water, it circulated around the two of them. Healing her meridians took a lot of energy. Not long after, the man in white's forehead was covered with fine beads of sweat. They dripped down the tip of his nose and landed on her face. Chapter 191. Her little face was getting redder and redder. It was obvious that she was getting better. He held her in his arms for almost 2 hours before he managed to nourish all the veins in her body. Finally, he made sure that her body was completely fine before he let go of her and stood up. The moment he stood up, he staggered and swayed. A ray of white light flashed past him and the man in white disappeared. The one standing at the same spot was the little ginseng baby that Ning Xuemo had mentioned. He was stunned for a moment and the corners of his lips twitched. He glanced at Ning Xuemo, who was still sleeping soundly. This little girl, was she his nemesis? He originally thought that he would be able to return to normal after 3 days of cultivation. However, he did not expect to be forcefully interrupted by this little girl on the last night. He was hugged and tied up by her and had to continuously use his psychokinesis to defend her and heal her injuries. As he had never encountered such a situation before, he did not have any experience. When he returned to his human form, he thought that he would be fine. When he used his psychokinesis frequently, he did not expect that there would be such serious repercussions. He had turned into a little boy again. When would he be able to change back? He raised his head and looked at the sky. The sky was already turning white and it would be dawn soon. By then, the wizardry barrier would disappear and the ferocious beasts on the 9th peak would appear. As he had lost most of his power, he would not be able to set up the same wizardry barrier. Without his protection, this little girl would not be able to survive on the 9th peak for even 15 minutes. It seemed that he had to think of a way to send her off the 9th peak first. What a troublesome little girl. Ning Xuemo was awakened by a slap on the face. Get up quickly. More demonic beasts are coming. The voice was crisper and softer than a grape. Ning Xuemo could not bear to hear the word demonic beast. She shuddered and jumped up. Where are the demonic beasts? She looked around and was suddenly stunned. Did she transmigrate again? The sky was already bright. Far away on the mountainside, the sun had just climbed out, and half of its face was red. The place where she was standing was indeed still by the water, but it was not the beautiful lake from last night. Instead, it was a deep pool that was not small in size. On three sides of the deep pool were steep cliffs that were as sharp as knives. On the cliffs, there were countless tall trees that looked like dragons. Those trees were lush and green, and as far as the eye could see, there were shades of green. The most important thing was that although these trees were of different species, most of them were coniferous trees that were commonly seen in the mountains. However, the strange trees that she saw last night with palm-sized leaves were nowhere to be seen. Large and small waterfalls cascaded down from the cliff, pouring directly into the deep pool beneath Ning Xuemo's feet. The sound of water was like thunder, splashing in all directions. Where was this? What about the mountain peak that looked like a mythical beast she saw last night? Where's the beautiful lake? Why are they all gone? Everything that happened last night couldn't have been a dream, right? Her gaze fell on the crystal rod by her feet. One end of the crystal rod was grayish-white, while the other end was dark green. It looked a little strange. This was the psychokinesis crystal that she had pulled out from the strange dragon last night. She looked around again and saw that the strange dragon's dismembered body was still there. All of this told her that this was not a dream. Everything that had happened last night was real. Right, where was the ginseng child? Ning Xuemo's gaze quickly scanned the surroundings, but she did not see any trace of the child. She seemed to have heard his call when she was unconscious. Was it an illusion? Chapter 192. She rubbed her eyebrows. Countless questions were swirling in her head, making her mind a little knotted. There was the body of the strange dragon, and there was the crystal rod. All of these showed that she was still in the same place as before. She remembered that the child said that there was a wizardry barrier around the place she was in. That meant that the scene she saw last night was most likely an illusion in the wizardry barrier. It was not real. Now that the sky was bright, it seemed that this was the most realistic scene after the wizardry barrier disappeared. The big lake last night should be this deep pool now. Oh no, the child sank to the bottom of the big lake last night. Could he be in this deep pool now? Why hasn't he come up yet? Did he run away or drown in it? Ning Xuemo looked at the deep pool and was about to take off her clothes and go into the water to take a look. But when she saw the clothes on her body, she was stunned. She was wearing a small snow-white robe that was as smooth as silk and fit comfortably. Her original dirty and tattered clothes were nowhere to be seen. She was very clean, as if she had just been taken out of the disinfectant cabinet. Even her fingernails were trimmed. The gaps between her fingers were clean and there was not a trace of dirt. She touched her hair again, then ran to the edge of the pool to look at her reflection. She saw that her hair covered her forehead, and there were two round buns on her head, which made her eyes look even bigger and her mouth small. She looked lively and cute. Ning Xuemo liked to pretend to be young, but that was to pretend to be a pig to eat a tiger. Now that she saw herself in such a fresh outfit, she was also not used to it for a moment. The most important thing was that she clearly remembered that she was covered in blood before she fainted. Now, she looked like she had just taken a shower. She lifted her clothes and looked at her arms and legs. They were as white as lotus roots that had just been washed. Then she found an even more terrible problem. She was not wearing underwear, she only wore a very expensive robe on the outside. Ning Xuemo was embarrassed. Damn it, it was like wearing a uniform to seduce her. Needless to say, This must be the work of the little ginseng child, because the white robe she was wearing was similar to the white robe that the little ginseng child was wearing. They were different ways to achieve the same result. Are you done? A voice suddenly sounded behind her. Ning Xuemo immediately turned around and saw the little ginseng child walking out from behind a waterfall. Did you bathe me with a spell? Ning Xuemo bluntly asked. You're too dirty, and I don't have enough psychokinesis, the baby answered concisely. Ning Xuemo's lips twitched. Did he mean that he had dragged her into the pool to wash her? She instantly imagined a scene in her mind. A small child would drag her, who was relatively large, into a deep pool, and then the little guy would swim around her and use his little hands to clean her bit by bit. She herself was stunned by this scene. This scene was too beautiful, and she couldn't bear to imagine it. She glared at the little guy. You've seen me naked. The baby calmly looked at her from head to toe. There's nothing to see. Ning Xuemo. Not only had she been seen naked, but she was also despised. Sister hasn't really developed yet. In another 3 or 4 years, you'll be a standard beauty. You'll be stunning, and you'll have enough suitors to circle the Chongkong country. I'm not like you. Ning Xuemo glanced at him. Even after 10,000 years, you'll still be a little radish head. Why do I feel that you've become a little smaller? Chapter 193. Was it an illusion? She actually felt that the little guy was a little shorter and his face was a little more tender. Previously, he looked like he was about 2 years old, but now, he looked like he was 1.5 years old. She could not help but pick him up. You're a few kilograms lighter. She held him in her arms and looked into his eyes. She was guessing, could it be that you're going back to your childhood, and you're getting smaller and smaller every day? The baby was speechless. He reached out his little hand to caress her little face, and the corners of his lips curled up slightly. This was the first time he had spoken so much. Little girl, because you're too stupid, you've implicated my main body, which is why it has become smaller. His little hand was smoother than her face, but his temperature was a little cold. Ning Xuemo felt like her face was covered with a piece of ice jade, which was cool and smooth. Her heart skipped a beat. It seemed that the little guy had used up his vitality to make the last move. Look, his little hand was still cold. The child could have escaped by himself, but he chose to stay and share her happiness and suffering. It seemed that his promise was true. Thinking of how she had tied him up, Ning Xuemo felt a little guilty. She looked at his little hand first. Not bad. As expected of a ginseng baby, his recovery ability was super strong. After being tied up for more than 2 hours, there was not even a red mark on his hand. It was still as white and tender as if it was carved from suet jade. Little guy, give me a pair of pants. She was still naked under the robe. There's nothing suitable for you. The baby shook his head. Even if there was nothing suitable for her, she had to make something suitable. It was better to sew underwear than to be naked. She suddenly thought of his doo-doo. Can you give me your doo-doo? Let me cut it. The boy glanced at her and said in an indifferent voice, no. He had given her such a good robe, but the doo-doo was not suitable. Was the doo-doo some kind of treasure? Then do you have any other clothes? It doesn't matter if it's big or small. I can sew it myself. She did not ask for much. She just wanted to get a pair of underwear. Otherwise, she would definitely be exposed when she climbed up the stairs later. The baby pondered for a while and reached into his sleeve. A moment later, he took out a piece of cloth and handed it to her. There's only this. Ning Xuemo looked at the piece of cloth. It was a snow-white material with an irregular shape. It looked like half of a pair of trousers. Ning Xuema glanced at him and felt a little puzzled. She thought that he would take out his spare pants, but she didn't expect him to take out a piece of cloth. She was not in the mood to pay attention to the child's strange behavior. She immediately cut the cloth with a knife. She had plenty of needles and thread on her, so she sewed a pair of underwear in a short while. She walked behind the big rock and put it on. The boy had been watching her work and had also stared at the underwear she had sewn. He had never seen such a style before. What a strange little girl. Her hands and feet were unusually nimble. Now that Ning Xuema had clothes, she felt a lot more confident. The material of the underwear was really good, and it was very comfortable to wear. With a smile on her face, she held the child's hand and asked, "Where did you get such good material? If you stay here any longer, you will become food for the magic beasts." The child was probably not used to being so close to people. He pulled out his little hand and did not answer her question. He looked up at the mountain peak not far away. The golden-eyed eagle is coming down. Chapter 194. Ning Xuema raised her head in shock and saw two golden-eyed falcons swooping down like little gliders. She had suffered a great loss under the claws of these falcons last night. If it weren't for these beasts, number 2 wouldn't have died. She wouldn't have had to come here. The image of number 2's bloody baby face flashed across her mind. Her eyes flashed coldly and she pursed her lips. "Little baby, let's destroy these two things, okay?" The little baby looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you hate them? My friend died under their claws. I want revenge. This is a world where the strong prey on the weak. If you're not as strong as others, you can't complain even if you die. If you want revenge, you have to be strong enough. Blindly fighting them is the behavior of a reckless man." The little baby sounded like a master lecturing his disciple. Ning Xuema was speechless. She was being lectured by a little baby. Actually, she understood all these principles. However, she felt indignant when she saw these vengeful birds. In her previous life, her martial arts were peerless and she dominated both the black and white sides. She would repay kindness with kindness and revenge with revenge. If she suffered a loss, she would immediately beat the other party up and get back at them. She had always been very protective of her subordinates. She protected them with her own strength and led them. She couldn't bear to see her subordinates being bullied. If her subordinates died in the hands of the other party, she would do everything in her power to avenge her subordinates. She had never let anyone go. This time, number 2 died for her, but she couldn't even protect his body. She could only watch as he was taken away by those stupid birds and turned into bird food. These birds were not afraid of poison and were invulnerable. With her current strength, she would be overestimating herself if she wanted to kill them. She pursed her lips. Revenge was a dish best served cold. Sooner or later, she would come back and destroy these birds' nest. For now, she had to think of a way to get down from the peak. "You're right. Let's go." Ning Xuema pulled the little baby and was about to run away. The two golden-eyed falcons were rushing towards the strange dragon's body. They hadn't found the two people behind the big rock yet. They still had time to leave quietly. "It's not impossible for you to take revenge now. I can teach you a move." The child spoke again. Ning Xuema's eyes lit up. "Good. What move?" She didn't know if it was too late for her to apply what she had just learned. The golden-eyed eagle's weak point is 3 inches below its left wing. It's good at freezing spells and belongs to the water element. "You can use an earth elemental weapon to break it," the baby said casually. The veins on Ning Xuema's forehead throbbed. Although she knew the golden-eyed eagle's weak point now, it was still under its wings. It was not easy to attack. Also, all the weapons she had were of the metal attribute. Where was she going to find an earth attribute weapon? She looked around and saw that she was surrounded by cracked rocks. He held a piece in his hand and looked at the child. What's the next step? He would probably teach her some kind of spell, right? The child answered straightforwardly, the next step is up to you. Damn. Ning Xuema was speechless. The child looked at her expression and said slowly, you're too weak now. You can choose to give up first and come back when you've mastered your skills. No one will laugh at you if you back out now. Ning Xuema looked down and smiled. The word back out doesn't exist in my dictionary. She patted the child's shoulder. Hide yourself well. I might not be able to take care of you later. Chapter 195. She leaped up and rushed towards one of the golden-eyed eagles. The two golden-eyed eagles were eating the corpse of the strange dragon. They stood on both sides of the dragon's corpse and ate without even lifting their heads. Ning Xuema almost rushed to the feet of the golden-eyed eagle before it noticed her. The golden-eyed eagle was a standard foodie. It hated to be disturbed when it was eating. When it saw Ning Xuema coming like the wind, it instinctively pecked at her. It didn't even bother to use its freezing spell. Obviously, it didn't think much of the small human. Ning Xuema's left foot moved and her right foot dodged. She used a special footwork to brush past the eagle's beak. She was very fast and her footwork was strange. Although the eagle was not slow, it didn't even manage to grab a corner of her clothes. The eagle was furious and pecked again. Pecked again and again, it pecked 7 or 8 times like a chick pecking at rice. Ning Xuema used her strange footwork to avoid it. While Ning Xuema was dodging, she could feel that her inner force had advanced to the next level. With the advancement of her inner force, naturally, her qigong had also advanced to the next level. Her body was light and her movements were as fast as lightning. She darted around under the golden-eyed eagle. The eagle was angry and finally used its magic weapon. It opened its mouth and breathed out bone-chilling white air, trying to freeze Ning Xuema. Ning Xuema's body was slippery like a loach. She moved left and right, and the eagle's cold air couldn't touch her at all. The stone under her feet was as slippery as a skating rink. Normally, animals would fall when their feet were frozen. Even the spiritual apes were no exception. However, Ning Xuema was an exception. She had learned ice skating and even figure skating. Even the world champion might not be able to catch up to her in terms of ice skating. Now that the ground was slippery, she was like a fish in water. Her speed was even faster than before. The golden-eyed eagle could only see her spinning after images. Finally, Ning Xuema found an opportunity. She jumped up and hugged the eagle's left leg. The eagle was both angry and shocked. At this time, it no longer dared to breathe out the icy white gas, so as to avoid freezing its own claws. It roared angrily, flapped its wings, and flew straight up. Then he used his right claw to scratch Ning Xuema on his left leg. Ning Xuema dodged left and right on its left leg, as if she was dancing around a pillar. The eagle could not catch her at all. Instead, it caught a few of its own feathers. The other golden-eyed eagle was obviously its partner. It also sensed that something was wrong and raised its head in surprise. The eagle's eyes were sharp, and it naturally saw Ning Xuema jumping on its partner's leg. The petite Ning Xuema was like a ping-pong ball lying on a basketball, not worth mentioning. Ning Xuema attacked a female eagle. The other male eagle was a standard foodie. It had a piece of strange dragon meat in its mouth. It glanced at the female eagle, paused for a moment, hesitated for a moment, and then continued to eat. They usually did not dare to provoke strange dragons. Now that there was a rare opportunity to eat this kind of meat, it did not want to give it up. It felt that its partner could deal with this flea-like human on its own. There was no need for it to go up and help. The child sat behind the big rock and looked up at the female eagle that had already flown into the sky. He watched as the eagle danced in the air like a pendulum, sometimes flying straight, sometimes flying diagonally, and sometimes swooping down. It was obvious that the eagle wanted to throw Ning Xuema to her death. Its flight was more fancy than an airplane performance. After all, Ning Xuema had such an experience. Her martial arts had improved compared to before. At this moment, she was like a super strong dog skin plaster. Chapter 196. After all, Ning Xuema already had this kind of experience. Her martial arts had also improved compared to before. At this moment, she was like a super strong dog skin plaster. She tightly held onto the eagle's thigh and stuck to it, refusing to let go. She didn't have the slightest intention of falling. Instead, her body gradually climbed up. Ning Xuema's white clothes were especially eye-catching on the dark brown eagle's back. The wind blew against her white clothes, making her look like a butterfly fluttering in the sky from afar. This scene was very shocking. The little child looked at Ning Xuema, who was gradually moving towards the left wing of the golden-eyed eagle. A strange light flashed in his eyes. This was the first time he had seen such an unyielding and clever girl, so, not all girls were pretentious and delicate. Who was she trying to avenge by fighting so hard? According to the information he received, this girl did not even have any friends. She only relied on an old servant. Could it be that the friend she was talking about was her old servant? No, her old servant's martial arts were very ordinary. He could not even reach the second peak. He did not even have the qualifications to provoke the golden-eyed eagle. Who could it be? He was suddenly curious. He sat there and did not move much. His eyes did not leave the eagle and human fighting in the sky. His fingers faintly formed a seal. He was about to cast a spell. Because the female eagle was desperately flying, Ning Xuema was also in danger. She did not dare to be careless. The eagle was flying so high that she did not dare to directly stab its weak point. Otherwise, it would instantly die and fall from the sky. If that happened, she would also die. She wanted to take revenge, but she did not want to lose her life, so she had been looking for an opportunity. The eagle did not manage to get her down. It was even more furious. It was also greedy for the strange dragon's meat on the ground. Damn it, it had only eaten a few mouthfuls. And its partner did not even raise her head. The meat was decreasing at a speed visible to the naked eye. The female eagle was angry. It decided to go back to the ground and try again. Anyway, the little thing on its leg was only lying on its leg and did not pose any real threat to it. It was more important to eat the meat. It could not let that bastard eat it all alone. The female eagle became more and more unbalanced. It simply folded its wings and dived down again. And Ning Xuema had been waiting for this moment. Her body instantly tensed up. She was getting closer and closer. Seeing that she was about 30 to 40 meters away from the ground, Ning Xuema's body suddenly shot up. Like an arrow leaving the bowstring, she directly arrived below the female eagle's left wing. The sharp stone stick that she had been holding tightly in her hand suddenly pierced towards the female eagle's weak point. Little doll, don't try to fool me. Elder sister's success or failure depends on this. She accurately identified the acupoints and poured all of her psyche power into the stone strip. It was as if she was stabbing tofu. Pooh! A sound rang out. Blood flew everywhere. The female eagle let out a mournful cry. Its body tilted to the side and fell down. After all, it was a bird, and in the process of flying down, it had a kind of inertia. Although it was crooked, it didn't fall straight down. It just happened to pass over the deep pool. Now is the time. Ning Xuemo immediately loosened her grip. Her body flew down and jumped into the deep pool. Plop! Plop! One small and one large falling into the water sounded one after another. After a while, Ning Xuemo emerged from the water and saw the female eagle's body floating not far away. She succeeded. She finally got her revenge with her own strength. There was another eagle. Its partner had died in her hands. It was bound to come for revenge. Chapter 197. There was also another eagle. Its mate had died in her hands, so it would definitely come to seek revenge. Ning Xuemo was already prepared when she floated out of the water. She even took the opportunity to grab a sharp stone. When the eagle came to catch her, she would do the same thing and hug the eagle's leg. Screech! She heard the eagle's sharp cry. A huge black shadow rushed into the sky. In a moment, it turned into a small black dot and disappeared. Ning Xuemo was speechless. Wasn't it said that eagles were the most loyal to love? They only had one mate in their life. If their mate died, they wouldn't live alone. A famous poet even wrote a very famous poem about this. Ask the world, what is love? It makes people live and die for each other. Two people fly from the south and the north. How many times do old wings go through winter and summer? Joy is interesting, parting is painful. The content of such a classic ancient poem was actually a lie. Did it have to be so deceitful? Even if it didn't die for its mate, it should at least avenge her. Why did it flap its wings and run away? Ning Xuemo felt that her worldview had cracked. Come up. You've jumped into the lake 3 times in just a few hours. A cold voice came from above her head. It was the little child's voice. Ning Xuemo jumped onto the shore. Then, she realized that her clothes were special. They didn't get wet when she jumped into the water. After she jumped onto the shore, her clothes were still fluttering in the wind. They looked very beautiful. Moreover, there wasn't a single blood stain on them. The little guy was very generous. He actually gave her a set of treasured clothes. She smiled and picked up the little guy from the stone. She smacked a kiss on his little mouth and said, "Moi, my dear." The little child was speechless. He calmly raised his hand and wiped his lips. He had known her for less than a day, but he had been kissed by her 3 times. What was shameful was that he was actually a little used to it. He didn't feel as disgusted by her sudden attack as the previous 2 times. Anyway, she didn't know his identity. So what if she kissed him? "Moi, does it mean kiss?" he asked. "Yeah." Ning Xuemo answered and excitedly put him down. Her eyes were fixed on the big bird floating in the water. "This is the first monster I've killed from the 9th peak. I'm going to dig out the crystal from its body." The baby pulled her back as she was rolling up her sleeves. "It's too late. If you don't want to be surrounded by beasts, then leave quickly." Ning Xuemo knew that he had a lot of experience on this mountain. She didn't have time to ask him why. She raised her hand and wanted to hug him. "I'll take you and run." Although the little fellow was quite capable, she was still small and her legs were short. If she really ran, she would definitely not be able to catch up with her. The boy dodged slightly and said, "It's not convenient to carry me." "Carry me on your back." He jumped onto her back without another word. "Where's the fastest way down the mountain?" Ning Xuemo asked. "To the east." The child was obviously very familiar with it. Ning Xuemo immediately turned around and dashed towards the east. As soon as she ran out of the valley, she heard a few roars of beasts coming from behind. The invisible murderous aura made the ground under her feet tremble slightly. Judging from the sounds, there was more than one beast that entered the valley, and none of them were chasing after her. Ning Xuema heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, she ran fast enough. Otherwise, her small body wouldn't be enough for the beasts to take a bite out of her. To the east, there was no road, only a fan-shaped cliff. The cliff was extremely steep, but fortunately, there were many trees growing on top of it. Ning Xuema's qigong was good, so climbing up the cliff was not too strenuous. Chapter 198. The little baby was also very obedient. He laid on her back and hugged Ning Xuema's neck loosely. His breathing was very light, and Ning Xuema almost could not feel his breath. Moreover, his weight was obviously lighter than other babies of the same size as him. He was only about 10 kilograms. Therefore, although Ning Xuema carried him on her back, she did not feel tired at all. Climbing the cliff was still very easy. The two of them also encountered a few magical beasts along the way. The little baby was especially strong today. Before Ning Xuema could react, he had already made his move. A few spells were cast, and before the magical beasts could reach them, they fell to the ground and died. Ning Xuema discovered that he used different hand seals to deal with different magic beasts. There were yellow, white, green, and blue rays of light. Every hand seal was the nemesis of the magic beast, making it so that the magic beast didn't even have the strength to retaliate and was killed by him in a few moves. What is your element? Ning Xuema was puzzled. Didn't they say that the geniuses of this continent have only one element and occasionally two? She knew a few of them who were like this. For example, Ji Yunhao was of the metal element, Ji Yunhuang was of the wood and fire element, and number 2 was of the water element. However, this little baby's spells were of all 5 elements, and they were all very smooth. I am not an ordinary person. The little baby coolly replied her. That's right, he was not a human. He was a ginseng baby who had cultivated for 10,000 years. Little baby, come, give sister another ginseng. Sister is hungry, little girl, I am much older than you. Even if you call me grandpa, I may not accept you. Don't call me sister this and that. The little baby's voice was cold, and he spoke like an old man. Hee, I know. You are 10,000 years old. But, who asked you to look like a baby? If you have the ability to grow up and become an adult, then I will call you grandpa. Ning Xuema smiled. The little baby pursed his lips. He did not want to lower himself to the same level as a little girl, so he slightly closed his eyes. He knew that there would be a time when she would call him grandpa. By the way, we've been through life and death together. We've known each other for so long, but I still don't know your name. Speaking of which, your ginseng has a name, right? The child paused for a moment before saying faintly, you can just call me Jiuzun. 9 Supremes. This name was quite grand. The emperor of the human world is called the emperor of the 9 and 5. If the old emperor heard you, he would probably punish you for your disrespect. He can't control me. The child's voice was indifferent. That was true. This ginseng baby was an immortal of the 9 peaks. The emperor of the human world didn't know of his existence at all. Naturally, he couldn't control him. Ning Xuema thought for a moment. Then I'll just call you Xiao Zhou or Xiao Zun. I feel that little 9 is easier to say. Call me Jiu Zun. The child refused to budge on this point. Fine, Jiu Zun it is then. Ning Xuema was too lazy to argue with him over such a trivial matter. Little Jiu Zun, are you the 9th child in your family? Could it be that there were actually 9 ginseng children? The veins on the child's forehead throbbed as he said faintly, I don't have any siblings. Did you come up with this name yourself? I guess so. No wonder. It seemed that this little fellow was quite ambitious and had been heavily influenced by the culture of the human world. He even had the intention to call himself an emperor. This name was grand, but it didn't really sound like a human name. However, he was a ginseng child. It wouldn't be strange no matter what kind of weird name he came up with. Chapter 199. As the two of them spoke, another horned lizard was eliminated. The lizard's attack speed was extremely fast, and the fireballs it spat out were not weak either. Even the rocks around it were instantly melted. If Ning Xuemo were to face it alone, she probably wouldn't even be able to last a single round. However, he had this little ginseng child with him. She was in charge of dodging while he was in charge of attacking with spells. In just 2 or 3 rounds, the horned lizard was finished. Ning Xuemo originally didn't have much hope of walking out of the 9th peak, but now her confidence was greatly boosted. With this little fellow by her side, it was as if she had a cheat code. Fighting felt so good. She had to think of a way to keep him by her side. Little Jiuzun, what are your plans for the future? Remove the word little. Did this little girl have to add a word? Alright, Jiuzun, you don't want to stay in this mountain forever, do you? I won't. Jiuzun was very straightforward. That's good. It seemed like this little child wanted to enter the world. That's right, he knew some things about the outside world, and it seemed like he often left the mountain. Jiuzun, you've seen my body. Ning Xuemo's words came from the sky. There's nothing to see. Jiuzun's most pertinent comment. Ning Xuemo resisted the urge to throw him out and reasoned with him. Even if there's nothing to see, you've seen it all. You know that if a girl's body is seen naked in this world, it's equivalent to losing her virginity. So. Jiuzun's deep blue eyes narrowed slightly. There was a faint coldness in his voice. So you have to take responsibility for me. Ning Xuemo replied confidently. Take responsibility for you. Marry you. Jiuzun's voice sounded like he was laughing, and it was impossible to tell if he was happy or angry. There's no need for that. Ning Xuemo shook her finger. You're still so small after all this time. By the time you grow into a man, I'll already be in the ground. Maybe even my bones will rot away. I can't wait that long. She was beating around the bush so that he wouldn't marry her. She didn't care about that. Jiuzun's eyes flashed slightly, but he didn't change his expression. Then what do you want? Before I leave the Heavenly Book Mountains, you will always be by my side. I can carry you on my back all the time. Ning Xuemo stated her condition. Usually, she could carry a backpack that weighed 30 to 40 kilograms as if it was just a game. This fellow was so light that she didn't feel tired carrying him. Moreover, he was like a big umbrella. It was worth it. This sovereign agrees to protect you for one day, only one day. Jiuzun spoke, his tone unquestionable. This was his bottom line. He had already broken his vow several times for her. TSK, TSK. This little fellow was really arrogant. She had just called him Jiuzun a few times and he was already calling himself the Supreme One. Alright, one day it was. One day was enough for her to run out of the 99,876th peak. For the next few peaks, she could rely on her own ability to get out. At this moment, the two of them were about to reach the peak of the mountain, but the sun was only a pole high in the sky. The day had just begun, so she still had plenty of time. Alright, one day it is. One day, an entire day, 24 hours, 24 hours. You can only leave me tomorrow at this time. Jiuzun's brows furrowed slightly. One day. He had other things to do at night, so he definitely couldn't bring her along. Hey, one day is only equivalent to half a day. One day. Jiuzun couldn't be bothered to reason with her. Forget it. Ning Xuema also knew that although this little fellow was young, he was a man of his word. Since he had already made up his mind, she wouldn't easily make him change his mind. If she ran a little faster, one day would be enough. As they spoke, they finally reached the peak of the mountain. This peak wasn't very big. Ning Xuema went around a large rock and saw the scenery on the other side. Then, she was beautifully embarrassed. Happy face. Chapter 200. The other side of the mountain, which was the side that truly descended the ninth peak, was actually straight up and down. It could be said to be at a right angle of 90 degrees. It was at least a few hundred feet high. The bottom was covered in clouds and mist, making it impossible to see the bottom. What was even more infuriating was that the entire cliff was smooth like a mirror. There wasn't even a single weed on it, much less a tree that could be used as leverage. She had seen many famous mountains and rivers, but this was the first time she had seen such a smooth cliff. Her qigong was indeed unprecedentedly good, but she didn't dare to just jump off this mirror-like cliff. Are you messing with me? Ning Xuema's tone was unfriendly as she glanced at the little guy beside her, wishing she could kick him down. This is indeed the closest place to descend the mountain. Jiuzun's face was nonchalant. Yes, it was indeed close. She could just jump down and reach the bottom in less than a minute. Of course, that was if she didn't turn into a meat patty. Ning Xuema inwardly sucked in a breath of air and glared at him. She found a large rock and sat down. She stretched out her hand towards him. Give me another 100-year-old ginseng. She needed to replenish her strength before going to the other peaks. Do you think 100-year-old ginseng is a carrot? Who cares if you're full or not? Jiuzun sat opposite her. You're the king of ginseng. Isn't it easy to get ginseng? You can't eat any more without ginseng. He answered simply. It seemed like this little girl had already fixed his identity. He couldn't be bothered to correct her. After all, they were just strangers who met by chance, a fate thinner than dew. There was no need to tell her his true identity, in case he scared her. Besides, he didn't want anyone to know his childish appearance. If this little girl had really seen through his identity, he might just kill her to silence her. It was better for such an interesting little girl to live longer. Ning Xuema's medical skills were high, so she naturally knew that ginseng was a great tonic. If it was any other time, she would probably get a nosebleed after eating less than half of it. However, her current body was different from before. Her inner strength had increased by leaps and bounds, and she could even absorb the essence of psychokinesis from the crystal. She thought that her current body couldn't be judged by common sense. It turned out that it was impossible to chew on a tonic like sugarcane. But she was so hungry now. He couldn't help but glance at Jiuzun again. Then what else do you have to eat? Ning Xuema was born with a pair of watery eyes. At this moment, because of hunger, her eyes were even more watery. Most people would not be able to resist her gaze and would obediently hand over the items. However, Jiuzun was clearly no ordinary person. He completely ignored her expression and only said, "Cloud tiger meat is edible." They had indeed killed a cloud tiger just now, and that cloud tiger was still lying on the ground not far away. Ning Xuema was speechless. It seemed that this ginseng baby was quite poor. He only had one ginseng in his pocket. The bonfire was lit again. The cloud tiger meat was cut into pieces and roasted on the tree branches. Ning Xuema's other skills were excellent, but her skills at barbecuing in the wild were ordinary. She had used the same amount of seasoning, but the taste was terrible. Using her former subordinate's evaluation of her, it was so terrible that it made one's hair stand on end. Actually, the meat of the cloud tiger was quite tender and tasted better than beef. However, after Ning Xuemo roasted a few pieces, the meat was either not cooked on the outside or was directly roasted into a piece of dried meat. Chapter 201. Ning Xuemo was actually a picky eater. She naturally lost her appetite when she saw the finished product, but her stomach was growling with hunger. If she didn't eat, she would definitely run out of energy. Helpless, she could only gnaw on a piece of dried meat. As she ate the meat, she naturally thought of number 2. It was a pity that she would never be able to eat his delicious barbecued meat again. Her heart sank, and the barbecued meat in her hands became even harder to swallow. Jiuzun had started meditating when she was busy, obviously not wanting to eat the food she barbecued. Later, he probably smelled the unbearable smell of the barbecued meat. His eyebrows twitched as he opened his eyes. Just then, he saw Ning Xuemo's neck stiffen as she tragically swallowed a piece of meat. Jiuzun looked at the meat in her hands in disbelief. It was as if he couldn't believe that someone as smart as her could have such amazing skills. He paused, unable to watch any longer. He walked over and tore the dried meat from her hands, tossing it aside. Dogs won't eat this even if you feed it to them. Let me do it. The little ginseng baby knew how to barbecue meat. Ning Xuemo was skeptical, but she still let him take her place. After a while, Ning Xuemo's eyes shone as she looked at Jiuzun. This little fellow actually had good skills. The meat he barbecued was fatty but not greasy, and tasted delicious. It was even better than the barbecued meat from her own era. Of course, it also surpassed number 2's skills. Ning Xuemo hadn't eaten yet, but she was already drooling just from smelling it. Watching him barbecue meat was also a form of enjoyment. Whether it was cutting or barbecuing, his movements were exceptionally smooth. With a flick of his wrist, a piece of delicious meat was cooked. Could it be that this ginseng baby also ate meat? Jiuzun, you barbecued meat often too, right? It's really delicious. I thought you relied on photosynthesis to survive by absorbing the essence of the sun and moon. So you eat human food often too. Ning Xuemo praised him as she ate heartily. Jiuzun was slightly stunned. He looked down at his hands, as if he hadn't expected himself to be so skilled at this. He was silent for a moment. Then, he took out a handkerchief from somewhere and wiped his hands clean. He said faintly, "Let's eat." Once again, he went back to meditate on the big rock. Obviously, he had no intention of eating it. He roasted a lot of meat, so Ning Xuemo ate to her heart's content. The thought of abducting him back home was overwhelming. Little 9 Supremes, are you bored in the mountains by yourself? Not bad. Look, you don't even have a friend here. I'm afraid you don't even have someone to talk to, right? Why don't you come back to the Marquis's estate with me? I have a lot of people there and a strange beast. If you're bored, you can play with it. I'm not going. I can take you somewhere else to play. Look at you. You've made yourself look like a fool in the mountains. You're just a kid, you should be full of vigor, but now you're acting like a little adult, learning to act cool like the Emperor. You're the 9 Supremes, not the Emperor. He's an old man, but you're not. Don't learn from him. Old man. Jiuzun's forehead twitched again. He glanced at her lightly. Don't judge some things for granted. Sometimes you'll find that you're very wrong. This time, he was finally more talkative. Are you saying that I was wrong in my evaluation of the Emperor? He's not an old man. He can't be a child, right? Ning Xuema was very sensitive. Jiu Zun was speechless. Chapter 202. Jiu Zun was speechless. After Ning Xuema finished speaking, her heart skipped a beat. Could it be that the child in front of her wasn't a ginseng child, but the ancestor's nascent soul? He was in Changkong country's imperial palace, but his nascent soul came here to cultivate. No. People in this era cultivated psychokinesis, not Tao techniques. Only Taoists had nascent souls. If he really wanted to leave his body with his nascent soul, he had to find an absolutely quiet and safe place where no one could disturb him. He should have chosen a secluded quiet room, not Changkong country's imperial palace. Not to mention, not only did he keep some servants and maids by his side, he even left Ji Yunhuang there. According to Ji Yunhuang, every time the ancestor entered the imperial palace, he would have someone accompany him. Occasionally, he would even talk to someone. He didn't just sit there and meditate. Under such circumstances, he obviously couldn't leave his body with his nascent soul. Moreover, although the venerable sovereign was wearing a mask, his hair and eyes were pure black. When she took a closer look, she saw that it wasn't a wig or cosmetic contact lenses. It was all real. As for the child in front of her, his eyes were as blue as the sea and his hair was as white as snow. They weren't fake either. They shouldn't be the same person. Perhaps this child had really seen the ancestor? They had both lived for more than 1,000 years, so it wasn't strange for them to know each other. Jiu Zun, have you really seen the ancestor's true face? What did he look like? People were like this. They would always be curious when they saw a person wearing a mask. They wanted to peel off the mask to take a closer look. So curious. Jiu Zun looked at her with a smile that wasn't a smile. You're so young, but you already have feelings for him. Feelings my ass. I'm not so hardcore that I'm attracted to an old man. Jiu Zun was speechless. She kept calling him old man, which made him want to beat her up. What if he's not an old man, but an extremely beautiful one? He glanced at her and added, maybe he's even more beautiful than you. More beautiful than her. Although her petite body hadn't fully grown yet, she was already a standard beauty. More beautiful than her. There was only one word to describe this kind of man, Ning Xuema said, I'm even less interested in a transvestite. Transvestite? What does that mean? Jiu Zun was silent for a moment before he asked shamelessly. The word was so new to him that he did not understand it. Transvestite is a kind of profession. Ning Xuema wanted to give him an encyclopedia, but on second thought, there would be more new terms to explain. It would be too troublesome to explain them one by one, so she just said it directly, it's a sissy, a fake woman. Now, Jiu Zun understood. His expression was about to crack. Who told you that he's a sissy? Ning Xuema took another bite of the barbecued meat. Oh, it's you. Didn't you say that he's more beautiful than a beautiful woman? Don't worry, I've never been interested in men who are too beautiful. Therefore, no matter how devastatingly beautiful Di Zun is, I won't like him. She still preferred those men with strong lines, who were as steady as a mountain. For example, her idol in the modern world was the tough guy Stallone, not those pretty little fresh meats. Jiu Zun, I hope you'll always remember what you said. He replied faintly. This topic was too stifling, so he decided to change the topic. You're a young miss of a Marquis Fu. Why didn't you stay in the manor, but came to the deep mountains for? He thought for a moment. What are you running away from? Chapter 203. This little fellow was quite sharp. He also knew quite a bit. It seemed like he often walked around the world. Ning Xuema took a bite of the meat. Do you know Luhinti? How's your relationship with him? I know him, but we don't have any relationship. Why? Is it related to him that you came here? No matter how much of a ginseng child entered the world, it was impossible for him to become friends with the emperor. After all, his tender flesh was the immortality pill that the emperor yearned for day and night. It was said that Luhinti often celebrated with the people on the city gate tower, so there were quite a few people who recognized him. The little ginseng child might have seen him hidden in the crowd. So he wasn't wrong when he said, I know him, but we don't have any relationship. Ning Xuema's thoughts moved quickly, and she quickly analyzed the situation. She smiled. Yes, it has a lot to do with him. He actually took a fancy to me and sent a lot of betrothal gifts. Jiu Zun looked her up and down. Didn't you break off the engagement with the sixth prince? Why? Lu Xian didn't agree. You even want the sixth prince to accept you. Oh, you know quite a lot about me. You even know about this. Ning Xuema looked at him suspiciously. Didn't this little child know too much? I went to your vast Sky Empire's capital about 10 days ago. Jiu Zun explained simply. Looking at her oily little mouth and hands, he threw a handkerchief over. Wipe them first. The handkerchief was snow white, and it was obvious that it was made of high-quality silk. Ning Xuema looked at it without batting an eyelid. This handkerchief was made of the best materials. However, it wasn't the same as the one used by the ancestor. The patterns and texture were different as well. It seemed like they weren't the same person. That sixth prince really isn't worthy of you. Since you made a bet with the sixth prince that day, and the ancestor child is the witness, this marriage should be annulled. Luhinti actually dared to disagree. You misunderstood. He didn't send the betrothal gifts to propose to his sixth son. He wanted to make me a concubine, and some beast concubine. Thinking about this title, Ning Xuema was a bit angry. Beast his sister. Jiu Zun. He looked at her again. I see. Why did you run away from the marriage? Isn't it the dream of many women to marry the emperor and enter his harem? Please. I'm only 13 years old this year, but he's in his 40s. He's old enough to be my father. I'm not going to marry a half-buried old man. Ning Xuema clapped her hands and stood up. All right, the gossip is over. Let's hurry up. Jiu Zun slowly stood up. So, in her eyes, 40+ meant he was an old coffin. Then let's go, let's go. Ning Xuema skillfully carried him on her back and turned around to walk north in large strides. She had to find another way since this route didn't work. Where are you going? To the North Peak. That stupid bird brought me up from that direction. She had been riding on the golden-eyed eagle's head. Although it had been dangerous, she had still seen the terrain clearly. Although the path down the mountain was very steep, there were many trees, so it wasn't difficult for her to go down. The North Peak is too far. Let's go this way. Jiu Zun obviously didn't want to take the long route. Dear, there's not even a strand of hair growing on this cliff. How am I going to go down? Grow a pair of wings and fly me down. Ning Xuema didn't even look back as she continued walking forward. Suddenly, she tripped, as if her legs were bound by something. Jiu Zun's voice sounded behind her. We can only go this way. You'll think of a way. Ning Xuema. Needless to say, it was this little thing's doing that her legs were bound. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.